Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Prince of the Eye audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 41, Sundering. Malum datum, 999.m34. Since the proclamation of Horus, the Imperium had faced tens of thousands of planet-scale rebellions, and more smaller uprisings than even the scribes of the Administratum could keep count of. The traitor legions and other renegade factions in the Eye of Terror sponsored and manipulated these revolts, spreading lies and cultivating anger against the Imperium before providing the tools with which, so they claimed, the oppressors could be overthrown. For over 3,000 years, the Ordo Hereticus had led the imperial efforts to uncover rebellious plots and crush them before they could reach fruition. For every rebellion that had unfolded, there was at least one other which the Sigillites' heirs had prevented. But as the end of the 35th millennium drew nigh, so did the greatest failure of the Inquisition. Individual worlds had broken free of the Imperium before, as had star systems, clusters, and even whole sectors. This time, however, an entire segmentum was about to declare its independence from Holy Terra. During the last decades, the worlds of Segmentum Pacificus had suffered from increased Xenos raids, as Orc forces and Dark Eldar warbands preyed upon isolated worlds, the later departing long before the Imperium could respond. On the world of Nova Terra, a conclave of the Segmentum's mightiest, most influential individuals declared themselves as the Ur Council, and announced that they had rejected the corrupt rule of the Imperium. They phrased their rebellion very carefully, not outright denouncing the God Emperor but instead those who claimed to rule in his stead, the High Lords of Terra, whom they accused of being self-indulgent petty tyrants who saw the human race as nothing but a resource to use in their own little games of power. All across the Segmentum, imperial representatives turned their coat or were eliminated. Tens of thousands of worlds declared their independence from the Imperium. Their motivations and rhetoric varied wildly, but at its core was the same anti-imperial sentiment. In their view, the Imperium had failed humanity. It did not protect the species, but enslaved it, crushing it underfoot to fuel its own existence regardless of the suffering caused in the process. Even the Forge worlds of Pacificus were affected by the spreading of rebellious ideas, despite the Mechanicus' ruthless methods of control. The Prophet of Cogs had remained in hiding, but had also sent emissaries from their secret redoubt, tasked with offering their knowledge freely to all who may use it to benefit mankind as well as help their brethren enslaved to the cult Mechanicus see the truth of their condition. When the Ur Council made their declaration, they seized the opportunity, rising up against their superiors in the Mechanicus Byzantine hierarchy. Scores of Forge worlds were ravaged in the ensuing conflicts, much to the Prophet of Cogs' horror, whose agents worked tirelessly to rescue those who could still be saved from the devastation. Still, not all of Pacificus was part of this rebellion. Entire sectors remained steadfast in their devotion to the Golden Throne, while worlds surrounded by rebels clung to their loyalty. The cardinal and shrine worlds of the ecclesiarchy had been spared from the worsening conditions of the Segmentum, protected as they were by the immense armies of the faithful, and their leaders vehemently proclaimed their utter and eternal dedication to him on earth. Those cults and rebellions which had been fostered there were crushed utterly, only for images of the brutality of these crackdowns to be diffused to neighboring systems, that they may witness the true face of the imperial faith. All of this was the result of centuries of preparation, a colossal undertaking that had required the cooperation of several traitor legions, under the ultimate direction of Horus Lupercal himself. The arch-traitor had allied with the ever-elusive Alpha Legion in order to orchestrate the rise of the Ur Council and the secession of Segmentum Pacificus. Night Lords' warbands had fanned the flames of fear and discontent by launching carefully targeted raids that left only atrocity and death in their wake, with no trace of the identity of those responsible. Infiltrators had redirected supplies and lost relief forces under the guise of the Administratum's usual incompetence. Members of the Inquisition had been drawn into labyrinthine webs of intrigue that ultimately led nowhere, with hundreds of them being killed within weeks of the Ur Council's proclamation by Horusian kill teams, their deaths arranged to further fuel rebellion against the Imperium by shattering the image of invincibility the Ordos took great pains to project. This did not mean that the Prince of the Eye now had control of the Segmentum. In truth, he didn't even control the Ur Council. While the Horusians and Alpha Legionnaires had agents in the Ur Council and hooks in many more of its members, they were vastly outnumbered, and kept their true allegiances secret. The purpose of this great rebellion, which only the heresy itself had ever surpassed in scope in the history of the Imperium, was not to create a new fiefdom for chaos outside the Eye of Terror. It was to put the High Lords into a position where no matter what they did, they would lose. When word of the Ur-Council's actions and the situation in Pacificus reached Terra, the prevalent reaction was shock, promptly followed by apoplectic fury. The High Lords sent mustering orders across the entire Imperium, and gathered a fleet such as the galaxy hadn't seen in generations in order to reclaim Segmentum Pacificus. Hundreds of billions of Imperial Guardsmen, tens of thousands of Navy ships, and thousands of Space Marines from several legions were assembled, along with the greatest Mechanicus armada seen since the days of the Great Crusade. The new Fabricator General of Mars, who had ascended to the position following the political nightmare that had been the prophet of Cog's unleashing of the Cyberghoul hordes and successful escape, was convinced that the Parliament of Mars had proclaimed an arch-heretic was behind the uprising of Pacificus. He was wrong. The prophet had remained untouched by the whispers of chaos, focusing instead on wielding the pure, untainted fires of science and reason to build up a small but prosperous, and more importantly, growing, utopia far from the Imperium's eyes. Alongside these military forces were veritable hordes of the Ecclesiarchy's faithful, whose numbers surpassed all the rest of the Crusade combined but whose fighting potential only equaled a fraction. The Space Marine commanders who had claimed overall command of the Crusade regarded them as little more than burdens on their logistics, but the politics of the Imperium meant they couldn't simply send them away, not to mention the fact most would have died of starvation long before returning to their home worlds. Plans were drawn for the reclamation of Segmentum Pacificus. The Asteroutes believed that a strike in depth, directly on Nova Terra and the heretical Ur-Council that had risen there, would shatter the morale and organization of the rebels. From there, they would then be able to strike at the other cores of resistance, crushing them one by one so that the diplomats could convince other worlds of the wisdom of returning to the Emperor's benevolent embrace. That plan wouldn't have been quick. It was estimated that the reclamation of Pacificus would last for decades, if not centuries. But before the Crusade could even begin, the powers that had manipulated the Segmentum's rebellion from the shadows made their move. Potent rituals were performed in the Eye of Terror and beyond, with great sacrifices of blood and souls offered up to the primordial annihilator under the patronage of Horus himself. The warp flared all across Segmentum Obscurus, causing cults of chaos to rise up in rebellion. Most of them were aligned with Kern, and summoned demonic hosts along with World Eater Chaos Marines, threatening to drown the Segmentum in blood. Only Space Marines could hope to stand against these foes, and the vast contingents of Asteroutes who had been gathered to lead the reclamation crusade of Pacificus were diverted, along with billions of guardsmen and Mechanicus engines, to defend against this new threat. With their departure, command of the Imperial Reclamation campaign passed into the hands of Imperial Guard officers and Puritan Inquisitors, whose approach to the Pacificus rebellion could best be summarized as extreme. Fanatical devotees of the Imperial Creed, they saw the rebellion of Pacificus as an insult to the God Emperor, and the entire Segmentum as tainted by Horisian ideals that would inevitably drown this part of the galaxy in madness and ruin if left unchecked. In their eyes, save for those few loyalist enclaves that remained, the entire Segmentum needed to be cleansed with fire, and they didn't hesitate in the application of the flame. From the onset of the Crusade, entire hives were raised from orbit, and the Exterminatus sanction was deployed on a dozen worlds. On planets whose infrastructure required a more subtle approach, hosts of guardsmen and fanatics hundreds of millions strong were deployed, with orders to wipe out the population completely so that new colonists could be brought in. Their minds filled with speeches about the threat of heresy, the men and women of the Astra Militarum performed their grim duty, those who dared question their orders executed on the spot by their commissars. If the Imperial High Command hoped to crush the spirit of the rebels with these displays of ruthlessness, it was soon disappointed. Horisian propaganda ensured that the rebels didn't see the wrath of the Imperium as something to be appeased through surrender and submission, but something to be defied. Public broadcasts denounced the Imperial atrocities, and claimed that all the people of Pacificus were in danger should the false Emperor's bloodthirsty servants not be stopped. Meanwhile, the leaders knew that, even if their people were only purged and subjected to even greater oppression should they surrender, their own fates would be unspeakably worse. Whether due to devotion to their people, true belief in the cause of freedom, or craven fear for their own hide, the leaders of Pacificus border systems refused to kneel again, no matter the cost. Faced with the might of the Imperial war machine, they swiftly became desperate, and searched for any method by which the invaders could be fought back. The dark god Nergal seized this opportunity, whispering terrible secrets into the minds of researchers working themselves to death to find some way to save their people from extermination. The Lord of Plague gave them the means to save their people from death itself, ensuring that their worlds would never be claimed by the Imperium. Faced with the desolation of their worlds, the leaders of 21 rebellious systems unleashed a weapon that was a mix of sorcery and biology, determined to deny the Imperium victory. A terrible pestilence swept across their worlds, killing all it infected, rebels and loyalists alike, and then raising them anew as living dead, their souls trapped within their rotting bodies, their horror and despair creating powerful warp storms that kept the Imperium from blasting the infected worlds into oblivion with their fleet's firepower. Some few were blessed with keeping their mental faculties, gaining great psychic powers from Grandfather Nergal and leading the teeming undead hordes into rebuilding their worlds into something more pleasing to the god of decay who had delivered them. Plague Marines of the Death Guard began to appear, summoned from the Eye of Terror by the undead lords, and swarms of Nergalite daemons manifested on those infected worlds that slipped ever closer to the warp itself. The kingdoms of the dead now stood between the Imperium and the rest of Pacificus, blocking the most direct roads to the Segmentum. Many warp paths remained, of course, for such is the scale of the galaxy that even 1,000 blockaded stars couldn't truly block all passages, but the Imperial advance slowed to a crawl. The rebels saw the kingdoms as the result of uncontrolled biological weapons, blaming it on the Imperium, a claim made all the more believable by the use of the Life Eater virus by the Inquisition on several condemned worlds prior to Nergal's interference. A quarantine was imposed, with any ship arriving from the kingdoms being immediately destroyed lest it bring the plague with it, and the rebel leaders swore that the death of the kingdom's populations would not go unavenged. News of the imperial crimes and defeats were also spread throughout the rest of the Imperium, causing a surge in rebellions that ultimately led to the dismissal and replacement of high command in Pacificus. Reclaiming the Segmentum was still a priority, but not only would current methods only reclaim a graveyard, the cost of the campaign might very well break the Imperium itself if things continued as they were. The scorched earth policies were abandoned in favor of more conventional conquest and subjugation, but the harm had already been done. None of the rebellious principalities of Pacificus would accept peaceful reintegration in the Imperium. A protracted and bloody conflict was inevitable, and the Lord Inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus feared that, by the very action of fighting it in the first place, they had already fallen into the archenemy's trap. Chapter 42, Kingdoms of Pacificus. Malum Datum, 013.m35. From their headquarters at Hydrafure, the remnants of Imperial Segmentum Command attempted to coordinate the efforts of those worlds and forces that remained loyal to the Imperium in Pacificus. Scattered guard and navy elements were redirected to bolster the defenses of loyalist systems, until the fall of Hydrafure in 013.m35, when a coalition of independent powers led by the Council of Urterra defeated their fleet and stormed the stronghold. Only the valiant sacrifice of the Cadian 666th Infantry, who had been reassigned to the defense of the headquarters, managed to delay the rebels long enough for the cogitators to be wiped of all information regarding the disposition of loyalist forces in Pacificus, thwarting the Ur Council's plans to hunt down the remnants of the Imperium at their leisure. With the kingdoms of the dead blocking the quicker passages and the fall of Hydrafure cutting off their most important source of intel, combined with the annihilation of the Crusades' vanguard when the kingdoms had first manifested, the Imperium was forced to concede the fact that, until further notice, all of Pacificus was independent. Those Space Marines who had been tasked with the Segmentum's defense had been mostly gathered for the crusade before being redirected, leaving only a handful of loyalist Asteroutes serving as kill teams for loyalist groups. With the collapse of the Adeptus supply lines, even these worlds were forced to rely on the weapons and equipment they could produce on their own or secure from nearby Forge worlds who hadn't succumbed to their own uprisings. By and large, each of the loyalist worlds of the Segmentum was on its own, and the consequences of the sundering were soon felt across 250,000 worlds. As one of the symbols of imperial authority, the Black Ships could no longer operate in Pacificus. After the first few instances of the sinister vessels being attacked, in at least one case under the secret command of Thousand Sons operatives, the remaining Black Ships left the Segmentum entirely. To compensate for the loss of tithed Psykers, the Sisters of Silent redoubled their hunt across the rest of the Imperium, scouring planets for witches to send to the Throne World for training or sacrifice to the Astronomicon and the Golden Throne. As soon as the sundering had begun, the rebels' military preparations had only intensified. Even in systems deep within the Segmentum, where the Imperium's advance wouldn't be felt for decades if not centuries, the need for protection was keenly felt. The Xenos raiders whose unchecked depredations had helped foster anti-imperial discontent were still here, and the formerly imperial worlds now had to see to their own defenses. After learning of what had happened in the kingdoms of the dead, the Prophet of Cogs reached out to the principalities which they believed weren't yet afflicted by the corruption of the warp, but were at risk of becoming so. Their agents freely shared the technology they had developed, allowing them to build up their military strength to a level matching that of the Imperial Guard, rather than being dependent on imports from Forge worlds and a handful of industrialist hive worlds as had been the case under the Imperium. Of course, even back then there had been weapon production everywhere. The PDFs needed to be equipped, after all, but new Astra Militarum regiments had been outfitted with war gear purchased from sanctioned production centers at ruinous cost to the local government more often than not. The paranoia of the Adeptus Terra had made sure of that, in order to diminish the risk of more dangerous weapons falling into rebel hands, a move which had also increased discontent as the people were unable to properly defend themselves. For many, however, the ability to build their own weapons wasn't enough, and of course, the sheer size of the Segmentum meant that the representatives of the Prophet couldn't get everywhere. The fear of the Imperium ran deep, and Pacificus leaders sought weapons that would allow them to keep their hard-earned freedom as well as defend themselves from the monsters that stalked the galaxy. The Mechanicus monopoly on technology had been abolished, letting the various governments begin their own research programs. In most cases, these were directed by former tech priests who had either joined the local revolution for their own reasons, or simply went along with it in order to survive. In other cases, unanointed citizens with mechanical leanings were recruited and had to essentially rebuild science from the scraps of lore they had scavenged from local Mechanicus outposts. Tens of thousands of research facilities were constructed, crewed by renegade tech priests and unanointed researchers alike, espousing the credo of science promoted by the Prophet of Cogs. Apart from military technology, the envoys of the Prophet of Cogs also brought with them devices that cleaned the atmosphere of polluted planets and set the long work of restoring ravaged ecosystems. Automation replaced manual labor, freeing millions of citizens from assembly lines with appalling productivity and freeing manpower for the various enterprises of the new regimes. A name began to circulate, attached to these wonders delivered by benevolent strangers, Nova Forenza. There dwelled the Prophet of Cogs, continuing their research for the benefit of all humanity and sending their apostles across Pacificus to bring the bounty of technology to beleaguered planets. The Ur Council of Nova Terra was, unsurprisingly, the most powerful of the factions within Pacificus. Its leaders had prepared their rebellion for generations. Even then, their influence was restricted to a few hundred worlds under their direct control and thousands more under their influence, which was only a fraction of the Segmentum's total population. As such, it was inevitable that different creeds would rise among the sundered Segmentum, and just as inevitable that conflict would follow between those who had rejected the Imperium's yoke. Soon, the first wars between local powers erupted as isolated kingdoms fought for resources or ideologies. Hordes of orcs looking for a good fight soon emerged from the Veiled region. The efforts of the Ur Council to present a Segmentum-wide united front against the threat of imperial reconquest failed to unite more than the sectors immediately threatened, as the people refused to simply trade the distant rule of Terra for that of Nova Terra. The name of the planet itself may not have done the Ur Council any favors here. Smaller-scale defensive pacts between worlds soon became full-fledged alliances, and lesser powers multiplied all over Pacificus. Though the Horacians had been the driving force behind the sundering, the other factions of the Eye of Terror were quick to seize the opportunities presented by so many systems being effectively on their own. Fear and isolation made the lesser powers easy prey for the infiltration tactics that had been honed since the proclamation of Horus, with the promises of military power becoming more tempting than ever before. Avenues of research that had been forbidden under the Imperium were now openly pursued. The resurgence of the orcs was a blessing in disguise for the agents of chaos in that regard. Freed from the Imperium's crushing propaganda and brainwashing, most of the rebel kingdoms of Pacificus would hesitate to declare war against fellow humans, but the Xenos brutes were not afforded any such consideration. Once footage of the horrors committed by the greenskins upon the humans that fell in their claws spread, there was no line the armed forces weren't willing to cross to keep the Xenos beasts from destroying their cities and devouring their people. As the influence of the dark powers grew, mutants began to appear among the population, but those weren't the deformed horrors that had appeared during the heresy. The Chaos Gods had changed their approach to match that of their champion Horus. Now the mutations they bestowed appeared benign, even beneficent. The old fear of the mutant cultivated by imperial propaganda began to dwindle, seen as just another instrument of imperial oppression. According to the rebel leadership, the Imperium had sought to create an internal enemy from an inoffensive section of its own population, simply to help maintain its control. The most martially suited of these mutants were recruited by the local armies, quickly forming elite corps within the new military structures that rose from the planetary defense forces. By that point, they were hardly the most unconventional units to be deployed. Entire battalions were commanded by wild psychers who had managed to gain some degree of control over their abilities and wielded them in service of their world of origin. Having heard the horror stories spread about the black ships and the human sacrifices taking place on Terra, they were among the most fervent supporters of the Sundering, willing to fight and die for their home world if it meant dying as free people rather than fuel for the designs of a distant, uncaring emperor. The battlefields of Pacificus became weird and surreal places. Weaponry that wouldn't have been out of place in mankind's first global conflicts was deployed alongside cutting-edge Firenze technology and occult devices drawing on the warp for power. Mutants and WYRDS fought alongside cybernetically enhanced troops against Orc war machins. Over time, the touch of chaos began to warp the cultures that had unknowingly embraced it, whether for survival and prosperity. Hundreds of systems within Pacificus became nightmarish empires of sin and torment, fueled by blood and sorcery, while others were just as dangerous beneath the deceptively normal facades they presented to their neighbors. Intrigue blossomed as the principalities spied and plotted against each other, while the flames of ambition, fanned by the taste of freedom, led to countless counter-revolutions and attempted coups, much to the joy of Tsianch. When the Hexarchy asked me to come work for them translating ancient texts of dubious origins, I thought I had found the perfect way to avoid being conscripted into the army we were raising to fight against the Orcs. As an academic, the rebellion against the Imperium had opened entire new fields of study that the Ecclesiarchy had previously forbidden. The idea of dying against the greenskin hordes when such opportunities presented themselves had been quite galling. I was told at the time that our work had the blessing of one of the Hexarchs, but I didn't pay it much mind. The work itself was much more interesting than whatever politics I thought were responsible for the project. The texts I was asked to translate were written in a script unlike any I had encountered before. The Hexarchy had obtained a basic translation key. When I asked where it had come from, I was politely but firmly told it was classified, whatever that meant, but it was incomplete and far too literal. After months of work, I managed to translate a description of a pagan ritual, which, if my translation was correct, was meant to sunder the veil between realities and grant the priest the wisdom of the gods. My overseers asked that we perform the ritual, despite my protestations that this was clearly some ancient religious text. I went along with them, thinking that they were testing if this old faith could be used as a replacement for the imperial creed we had broken free of. The academic in me understood the need for something to believe in, after so many centuries of being manipulated by the Ministorum, but I confess I had my doubts on the righteousness of that course of action. Obviously, I didn't think it would work. But it did. Somehow the chanting, the incense, and the lines drawn in powdered bone were enough to break the laws of physics. That night, I made contact with the Imperial Ones, and understood how small we are in the grand scheme of things. Crucially, I also understood how small they are too, for all that they tower above us. This was 10 months ago, and now our Imperial soldiers fight on the front lines against the Orcs, each of them a dedicated servant of the Hexarchy whose spirit has been entwined with an Imperial One through our rituals. Less than 100 of them, yet they have won us victories entire companies of tanks would have struggled to deliver. Yes, the price is high, higher than I would like, but I have seen the numbers, and I know that this is the kinder path. Only through mastery of the Empyrean can the Hexarchy prosper in this hostile galaxy, and through our work that mastery shall be achieved. From the private writings of Ephraim Wolf, head Imperial researcher of the Hexarchy, one of the greatest stellar kingdoms to emerge in Segmentum Pacificus post-Sundering. Among the most successful attempts by the Eyes factions to influence Pacificus was Warpsmith Andraz, who shaped the rise of a powerful stellar empire, the Caranian Dominion, for over 50 years after the Sundering. Eventually, he came to rule openly over a score of planets where the entire population lived in a state of constant martial law. Cruel enforcers augmented with dark tech cybernetics patrolled the streets, while factories that covered entire land masses spat out thousands of tanks and uncountable tons of ammunition and ship components for the Warpsmith's growing fleets. Through it all, the Warpsmith's goal was to muster enough strength to conquer Nova Forenza and claim its technology for the Fourth Legion, along with cutting off the new technologies which brought hope and salvation to billions, making the traitor Legion's subversive efforts much more difficult as the Prophet of Cogs still vehemently opposed anything warp-related. After decades of searching and countless sacrifices, Andraz eventually located the elusive stronghold of the Prophet of Cogs. But when Andraz led the assault, his force of daemon engines and cultists was wiped out to the last, his fleet annihilated, and his own company of iron warriors slaughtered before firing a single shot. The Warpsmith's soul was summoned from the warp at Perturabo's own command by the Fourth Legion's sorcerers, and thrown into the Forge of Souls as punishment for his abject failure. In Andraz's absence, the Caranian Dominion promptly fell apart as his mortal lieutenants turned on each other, each desiring to claim the Warpsmith's throne for themselves. The resulting civil war left most of the Dominion's worlds as smoking ruins, though the remnants of their horrific technology would continue to plague Pacificus for centuries, as officers of the dissolved military led their troops in their own campaigns of conquest or became raiders and pirates. Other, subtler efforts were met with more success in the long term. The Hexarchy, using texts recovered from the husk of Colchis, the former home world of the Word-bearers, made great stride into mastering the art of creating daemon hosts, using them as shock troopers in their wars to great effect. On Tanith, a circle of daemons posing as benevolent supernatural entities assisted the rebels in overthrowing the local imperial government, offering boons of strength and knowledge in return for worship, only for the price of that worship to slowly increase over the next decades, along with their influence on the world. On the hive world of Vergost, devices from the dark age of technology were discovered and, after years of trial and error, successfully duplicated. These small augmetics were immortality inducers, regenerating the flesh of their hosts from all but the most complete of annihilation. By equipping their soldiers with them, the Vergastian armies became all but unstoppable, though the process of dying and being reborn took a toll on their soldiers. Each death exposed them to the warp before their souls were dragged back into their reconstructed bodies, and sometimes they brought something else back, which was why the lords of Vergost didn't use the devices for themselves. Even the mysterious new empire of Fabius Bile reached out to several principalities, offering them cloning technology with which to replenish their troops, before going further and subjecting entire armies to unholy alteration procedures designed by the demented mind of the Man-Flayer. When the arch-alchemists of Gavian 11 got their hands on a Blood Angels recruiting center, their attempts at creating their own space marines drew the attention of Bile's agents, leading to the creation of the Revenants, clone-born transhuman warriors whose thirst for blood made them as dangerous to their masters as their enemies. To the Inquisition, the situation in Segmentum Pacificus was a prelude to what the ruinous powers would make of the entire galaxy should the Imperium fall. To Horus Lupercal, however, it was a testing ground for new methods and ideologies, as well as for the weapons and armies with which he would inevitably bring about the destruction of his father's failed empire. Chapter 43, The Ruin of Comeric. Malum Datum, 296.m35. Though it hadn't been without setbacks, the sundering of Segmentum Pacificus was still a great victory for Horus. It was unclear if the rebellious Segmentum would maintain its independence for long. Even as militarization ramped up within its borders, it remained far weaker than the Imperium, and much more disunited. Still, the Prince of the Eye was satisfied with the results, and now turned his baleful gaze elsewhere. Since before the Great Crusade, the Xenos raiders known as the Dark Eldars, or Drukhari, had preyed upon the worlds of humanity. Indeed, there were ancient records from before the Age of Strife that spoke of entire human worlds depopulated by the forebears of the present-day Eldars, though the motive behind these depredations had at least partially changed since the fall that had put an end to the Yildari Empire. Consumed by the curse of the dark god Slaanesh, whom the decadence of their ancestors had spawned, the Drukhari were forced to feed upon the suffering of others lest their darkling souls be swallowed by the one they called She Who Thirsts in fearful whispers. Over the centuries, untold billions had been taken by the raiding fleets of the Drukhari, sentenced to a fate worse than death in Comeric so that their tormentors could feed off their pain and the twisted industry of the Dark City could continue to turn, its thorned gears oiled by the blood of the weak. The Imperium's highest circles knew of the existence of Komarok, but the Dark City was too well hidden within the webway to be easily reached, and far too heavily defended to be destroyed by anything but a full commitment of the Imperial war machine. Furthermore, the highest-ranking members of the Ordo Xenos suspected the existence of terrible weapons held in the vaults of Komarok's ruling families, devices capable of unspeakable destruction which the foul Xenos wouldn't hesitate to unleash should their power base come under threat regardless of the cost to themselves. Spite, after all, was a language spoken by all species. With the right alliances among the craft world Eldars, or the right prisoners to interrogate, it might be possible for the Imperium to find and destroy Komarok. The question was whether the dying curse of the Drukhari would leave them capable of surviving their other enemies. Preoccupied as it was with the prosecution of the Long War and 100 lesser foes, the cold calculations of Empire meant that mankind was forced to continue to endure the Drukhari's existence. Because of this, the Dark Eldar's greatest concern had long been the White Scars. Since the raids on Kogarus during the Heresy and the disappearance of Jagatai Khan in the Webway during the Scouring, the 5th Legion had dedicated most of its strength to fending off the various pirates and raiders that preyed upon the Imperium, reserving the bulk of their wrath for the children of Komarok. Horus cared little for the men, women, and children subjected to the agonies of the Dark City, of course. The empathy he'd once been known and celebrated for had long since been lost to the whispers of the ruinous powers. Yet the same monstrous pride that the Dark Gods had used to turn him to their cause also meant that his disgust for Xenos preying upon mankind had remained just as strong. For all their rejection of the dead Yildari gods, the Drukhari still paid homage to the Dark Prince, whether they admitted it or not. Every act of torture, every cut inflicted on a helpless prisoner, every act performed to try and feel something through centuries of sense-deadening horrors, was a prayer to the Lord of Excess. The Yildari had turned their back on Slaanesh when the Dark Prince had been born and suffered the fall in consequence, but the War Master of Chaos knew that the youngest god might yet forgive them for this insult. Eldar souls were favored above all in the Court of Excess, though only a handful of children of Isha willingly and openly gave their devotions to Slaanesh at the moment. Yet Horus would brook no rivals to humanity's destiny as he saw it. The Eldars had their chance, but had flinched on the brink of apotheosis. Slaanesh might be content to prolong their slow extinction in order to extract every morsel of torment it could from them, but Horus saw things from a more pragmatic perspective. If the Imperium couldn't deal with the Drukhari, then Horus would do so instead, and prove once more that he alone was worthy of the crown of Master of Mankind. The Emperor himself had failed to remove the threat of the Dark Eldars during the Great Crusade. Regardless of his reasons, the propaganda value of such a coup alone meant it was worth pursuing. And the super weapons of the Drukhari great houses would also serve Horus well, once the time for manipulation and subtlety had passed and his forces faced those of the Corpse Emperor in open battle, as he knew would inevitably happen one day. As with all advanced Yildari technology, these weapons required psychic ability to use, something that the Drukhari had denied themselves in order to avoid the doom, but which Horus' servants possessed in abundance. So it was that Horus began to plan the destruction of Komarok. Yet for all of Horus' great power and the freedom of action he'd enjoyed since the Dark Gods had slackened their control over him after their fateful decision to change their plans for the Long War, the Prince of the Eye was still bound to the will of the Warp's infernal suzerains. The Dark City was an important stronghold for Slaanesh, and the center of many of the Dark Prince's schemes. Before he could begin his preparations, Horus had to gain Slaanesh's approval of his plan, and pay a tithe to the Lord of Excess commensurate with the damage it would inflict to the Dark Prince's position in the Great Game. Of course, the other Chaos Gods would revel in such a diminishment, but Horus knew better than to expect gratitude from them. The balance between the four was crucial to the War Master's greater goals, and so he struck a bargain with Slaanesh. Horus would pay a six-fold price to Slaanesh in return for his blessing, but in return, Komarok would fall and the Horusians would suffer no punishment from the Lord of Excess. In truth, Slaanesh had grown bored with the Drukhari. The current course of the Long War, with its emphasis on cults and subtle corruption of the imperial edifice, was one for which the Dark Prince was well suited, and his power had grown, with the so-called nobility of the Imperium of Man being particularly vulnerable to the lure of excess. Furthermore, the White Scars had now denied the Dark Eldars raiding parties their easy prey for the past 4,000 years, in revenge for the depredations visited upon Kogarus during the Heresy. With the teeming worlds of humanity denied to them, the noble houses that led the Drukhari, and whose bloodlines had once ruled the cosmos under the Eldari Empire, had been forced to adapt. Explorers had been sent across the infinite void aboard the fastest ships the arsenals of Commeric could build, to find worlds populated by lesser alien breeds. Dozens of nascent civilizations had been extinguished in the cradle so that their bloody corpses could be thrown into Commerica's hungry maw, including a strange species of blue-skinned humanoids that had grown to sentience on a world of the eastern fringe. Even this hadn't been enough to compensate for the dearth of agony afflicting the Dark City, and so the Drukhari had turned on one another in a bitter struggle for survival. The houses, led by the three dynasts, had turned on their so-called lessers, who had reacted by banding together in meritocratic cabals for mutual protection, led by the charismatic and devious Asdrubal Vecht, a former slave who had sworn a vow that he would one day rule over Commeric. The Dark Eldars gained little from the torment of their own kind, as their souls already belonged to Slaanesh, but every Drukhari removed from Commeric was one less rival for the limited supply of agony available. This, most of all, had earned the displeasure of the Lord of Excess. Horus spent many years planning his assault on the Dark City, careful not to let any sign of his intent slip to the Comorites. Then, finally, in the year reckoned as 296.M35 by the imperial calendar, the Prince of the Eye executed his plan. Through manipulation and intrigue, the houses and the cabals were set upon each other in bloody warfare, the dynasts determined to drive the upstarts into the dirt, and Vecht's allies burning with the desire to carve a place for themselves in Drukhari society. Tens of thousands of Dark Eldars perished in brutal skirmishes all across Commeric, along with hundreds of thousands of slaves caught in the crossfire. Yet this was all only a prelude, and a means to force the Drukhari lords to recall their forces from abroad back to the Dark City to help fight their rivals. Once the situation was sufficiently chaotic, treacherous cults of Slaanesh among the Dark Eldars led Horusian strike forces through the webway. Since the day of the fall, there had been those among the Drukhari who sought to escape dissolution in the Dark Prince's maw by swearing themselves to him, hoping to earn a better afterlife or simply consumed by Slaanesh's hedonistic tenets. Such heretics and traitors were hunted down without mercy by all other Drukhari, but there were always more to take their place, and now they had brought Commerica's doom. In exchange for this service, the renegades were granted passage to the Horusian dominion in the Eye of Terror, and a daemon world to call their own and reshape according to their whim and the will of Slaanesh, along with its entire mutant population to do with as they pleased. Thus were the Shailat, the children of Hell in the Eldar tongue, reborn from the ashes of the Eye's first and most terrible war, when the forces of the three elder dark gods had hunted down and wiped out the corrupted Eldari who had been transfigured by the fall. Under the protection and patronage of the Prince of the Eye, the Shailat would serve Slaanesh forevermore, as had been promised. Thus was the first of the 6 offerings made, and Horus armies delivered to the Dark City. Shrouded from immediate detection by sorcery and the chaos already raging in the streets, they moved to their objectives in small, elite groups. Horus had selected his best warriors for this operation. Hunting parties of the Night Lords descended into the depths of the Dark City, led by Talos Valkyrin, the sole hunter and herald of the Night Haunter. They had been given a single mission by the Prince of the Eye, to hunt down the eldest of the Homunculi, Lords of Life and Death and the oldest souls to have ever eluded Slaanesh. As Talos' renown in the Eye of Terror had grown, so too had his powers. Now he could direct the visions that had previously crippled him, using them to pluck knowledge of his prey's position in space and time. The covens of the Flesh Crafters were well defended, of course, but the demonic gifts of the 8th Legion proved superior to both traps, mundane obstacles, and armies of biomanipulated horrors in the end. One by one, the last living members of the Eldari Empire were dragged out of their hiding places, their pale bodies branded with Sorcerouse sigils that ensured that this time, there would be no resurrection for them, regardless of the precautions they had taken. Talos himself ended the life of Urian Rakarth, leader of the self-proclaimed prophets of flesh, and witnessed the wretched soul of the antediluvian monster dragged into the Silver Palace, where Slaanesh awaited. Thus was the second of Horus' promised offerings to the Dark Prince made. Meanwhile, in the palace of Lord Dynast Zelion, emptied of all but the most essential personnel by the growing unrest, the blade of Ptish performed its deadly craft. Any loyalty the assassin might have once possessed for its people had been gone long before it had been brought before Horus by Kurz, and it executed its mission without any hesitation. Dozens of Zelion's most elite guards perished without ever seeing their killer, every death an offering to Slaanesh, For the blade of Ptush now wielded knives that had been crafted in the Forge of Souls at the War Master's request, and a powerful Slaaneshi daemon was bound within each blade. Deeper and deeper into the palace went the blade of Ptush, until it stood before the doors of one of the many vaults holding the dynast's plunder, as well as the many gifts tithed to him by his subordinates. With devices provided by the Dark Mechanicum, it opened the gate, deactivating the many traps guarding it in the process. Moments later, the assassin left the palace with its prize, though not before sabotaging the shield generators and setting several generators up to detonate, further adding to the confusion when Zelian saw his palace vanish in a sphere of white-hot light 6 minutes later. The prize the blade of Ptush had stolen from the dynast's vault was one of the few Zelian had claimed in person. Several centuries ago, in a fit of pique over the spiritual famine afflicting Komarok, the Drukhari lord had led a raid on the forge world of Verdigris 9, deep within the Imperium's borders, in an attempt to prove to the Monki that for all their stalwart protectors' best efforts, nowhere was truly safe from the Yildari Empire's truest heirs. In addition to the millions of Mechanicu's thralls taken as slaves and the homunculus-created toxins released in Verdigris 9's atmosphere guaranteeing the world would be poisoned for centuries to come beyond even the augmented tech priest's capabilities to endure, Zelian stole a priceless relic that had only recently been sent to the Forge world, a newly rediscovered standard template construct. Known as the Panacea, this STC contained the technological knowledge to heal almost every sickness and ailment to have ever plagued mankind. Zelian had stolen him for himself as a way to reassure himself that he and his kin were still the galaxy's greatest predators, and promptly locked it away in his vaults. Now the STC was in Horus' possession, and soon the medical marvel would be perverted by the apostles of Slaanesh in the Prince of the Eye's domain. From it, 101 dark miracles would be created and spread across the stars, to help the cults of Slaanesh spread the word of their dark prince. Thus was the third part of the Prince of the Eye's bargain fulfilled. By now, word of the Astartes' presence had begun to spread, the veils of sorcery that had concealed the Night Lord's presence having dissipated during their hunt for the homunculi covens. Yet still, the houses and the cabals were more preoccupied with each other than with the intruders in their midst, rightfully fearing that turning their focus to the Monki gene-bred brutes would allow their rivals to fall upon their backs. Even the slaughter of the homunculi covens, whose services granted immortality to the Drukhari willing to pay their price, wasn't enough to convince them otherwise. Not all of the covens had been targeted by the Night Lords, after all, only those led by the twisted Yildari survivors. Of course, had the Dark Eldars realized that the strike force was fighting its way down the depths of Komarok and toward Ka'in's Gate, the towering webway portal that had been one of the Dark City's major thoroughfares before the fall and which now led only into the raw fury of the warp, perhaps their attitude would have been different. And, had they known that, among the sons of Horus that made up the warband was none other than Horus Lupercal, his terrible presence shrouded by the efforts of his sorcerers and the constant work of his own will, then they would most certainly have put their differences aside to deal with this common threat. But the Prince of the Eye had made sure the arrogant Drukhari would only realize his presence and goal once it was far too late. When the Harlequins of the Shattered Dream, whoever lurked near Ka'in's Gate to guard against the horrors it contained, attempted to ambush the Chaos Marines, the War Master of Chaos finally revealed himself, the mere sight of him sending the disciples of the Laughing God into agonizing fits that made them easy prey for the fallen Primarch's escort. Then, at last, Horus stood before Ka'in's Gate. With a smile on his lips and triumph in his grasp, the Prince of the Eye set to work. Ka'in's Gate lies open before Horus, its ancient wards shattered by his awesome power. Behind it, he sees the numberless legions of excess, ready to pour through and claim the souls of those whose sins gave them birth. For now, they are paused, awaiting his permission to pass. They can sense his power, from the meanest daemonettes to the towering keepers of secrets, and they fear him, each and every one of them. Now is the time to impose the bindings that will restrain them, the commands that will keep them from laying complete waste to the Dark City so that its hollowed, burned-out carcass can be used as a staging ground for his forces. From there, they would have access to the entire webway, nowhere in the galaxy would be beyond their reach. Dorn's proud Kadayan Gate would become obsolete in one fell swoop. He raises his talon to begin the weaving. Pain. So much pain, lancing at his side, burning his very soul. He has to use all of his will just to stay standing, to keep any sign of weakness from showing, because if the daemons before him see it, they will tear him apart, regardless of the bargain he made with their patron. He cannot put the binding into place. He cannot force his will upon the legions of excess. Instead, he lowers his claw, turning the gesture into an invitation. The hosts of Slaanesh pour through the broken gate in a tide of smooth skin and gleaming carapace, parting around the Prince of the Eye. Despite their infernal senses, none of them sense the blood pouring from his flank, the only thing his power is capable of now. The wound dealt to him by the Emperor on the vengeful spirit has torn open again. It took him centuries to recover from his battle against the masters of the Forge of Souls, and he knows it will take him even longer to recover from this. He isn't blind to the cruel irony of his situation. He could wait for the wound to fully heal, though it would take millennia. But in the meantime, he would be powerless, unable to act, and that is anathema to him. Truly, it is a most ironic trap the dark gods have woven for him. Horus Lupercal grits his teeth. No matter. Plans change. This is still a great victory, bringing him closer to his ultimate goal. He will rise to the Pantheon's challenge. Pouring out of Cain's Gate, the legions of excess spread across Commerick in an unstoppable tide. Every Drukhari locked in fratricidal battle felt their arrival, a keening pain in their withered and blackened soul and a crushing sense of abject terror at the doom that had come for them. The shrines of the incubi fell one by one, their trophies claimed by the children of Slaanesh along with their souls. In the great shrine, Drazar the Executioner, Master of Blades and fallen Phoenix Lord, kept fighting long after the last of his students had perished, surrounded by so many demonic corpses they didn't have the time to dissipate back into the warp. Such was the fury and martial prowess of the Executioner that it drew the gaze of Khurn, who had been observing the destruction of Commerick with great interest. The Drukhari's endless scheming and preying only on weak prey disgusted the god of war, but the raw hatred that consumed Drazar was beautiful in his burning eyes. As the Lord of the Incubi finally fell, the Lord of Skulls decided that letting his rival claim that particular soul would be a waste, and plucked Drazar's soul from his flesh before the Dark Prince could devour it through the mouths of the demonic swarm. Slaanesh's thwarted screams shook the realms of chaos, but Drazar's fate had not been part of the bargain the Dark Prince had struck with Horus. And so the spirit of the Master of Blades was taken into Khurn's realm, there to be remade anew as it had twice before, once when the Ealdari who would become Drazar had been saved by Azurman, and another time when he had fallen from the path his master had laid down for his people to follow. In the Bone Middens, the Wych cults fought hard against the Neverborn, and none fought harder than the legendary Queen of the Knives and succubus of the Cult of Strife, Lelith Hesprax. Her grace surpassed that of the lesser children of Slaanesh, her speed and reflexes enhanced beyond the superhuman limits of the Drukhari race by centuries of single-minded training in the pursuit of martial perfection. She danced amidst the throng, and the Neverborn danced with her even as they sought to flay her pristine skin and gorge themselves on her potent soul. Lelith might have been able to keep up this dance forever, or until she found a way out of the Middens and toward the sections of Commerick still held by her dark kindred. The Cult of Strife were prominent among the Wishes, and entire armies of Drukhari yet remained within the confines of the Dark City, led by Archons who, loath to let even this most ruinous of crisis go to waste, were gathering what assets and allies they could amidst the devastation. But the Neverborn had allies of their own, and those moved more swiftly, driven by the will of Horus Lupercal. With Cain's Gate open and his attempt to bind the demonic hordes failed, the Prince of the Eye had summoned the additional forces waiting for his command in the Webway. Initially meant to assist the legions of excess in the purging of the Dark City and the capture of key areas, they were redirected to new objectives. To the Bone Middens, Horus sent some of his most powerful weapons, possessed marines created from the fusion of the greatest Horusian Astaroths and the most potent daemons that could be bound by sorcery. Each of these greater possessed had been subjected to decades of preparations before their transformation, their very skulls had been surgically broken and the inside of them engraved with sigils of power, their minds trained in the secret truths of the warp, their bodies augmented with drugs bought from the new empire at exorbitant prices. Flying on mutated wings, 5 of these monsters descended upon Lelith Hesprax. The Queen of Knives managed to slay 3 of them before the remaining 2 finally killed her, tearing her flesh apart and sending her soul hurtling into the Sea of Souls, where the Dark Prince awaited eagerly for her arrival. And so Slaanesh received the 4th prize Horus had promised him. As the demonic incursion continued and more daemons poured through Cain's Gate, that which the Dark Eldars called a disjunction seized the entirety of Commerick. The warp mixed with the substance of the Webway, and new infernal portals manifested everywhere, allowing new demonic hosts to enter. Most belonged to Slaanesh, but there were others belonging to the rival powers, drawn to the devastation like vultures to a battlefield. Like children fighting over a toy, the dark gods vied for control of Komarok, a situation that could only end one way. The structure of Komarok as a realm of the webway was, by nature, anathema to the stuff of the Empyrean. Horus knew this, and ordered his forces to withdraw from the Dark City, taking with them as much plunder as they could, along with millions of human captives rescued from the slave pits, desperate to escape the hell that had consumed their existence since their capture. Eventually, the inevitable came to pass. The work of the Old Ones had endured for millions of years, but entropy claimed all in the end. The walls of Komarok cracked, and the raw stuff of the Empyrean poured through, dissolving all reality. Spires that had survived the fall tumbled, and wonders and horrors without equal in the entire galaxy were consumed by the Sea of Souls. Shrieking Drukhari and terrified slaves were all engulfed by the seething madness, made equal at last in their final moments. So died Komarok, and its destruction sent shock waves across the webway. Shadi-Om, which for thousands of years had been the sole rival of the Dark City, was unmoored from the labyrinthine dimension entirely. Drawn into the warp, it came crashing down on Aftermath, the city of cities, where its population was promptly set upon by the Eldar-hating locals and the masters driving them. Eluriak, the tyrant of Shadi-Om, was dragged from the ruins of his palace at the end of a long and bitter battle, and subjected to all the torments the exiled masters of the Forge of Souls could design before his soul was sent to Slaanesh. Of the millions of Drukhari who dwelled in Shadi-Om, a scant few hundreds managed to survive past a standard Terran year, finding places in Aftermath beyond the sight of the masters. Most of them, it was said, ended up joining the houses of pleasure and pain belonging to Zireaat, the so-called daughter of Fulgrim, a fate arguably not too different from being cast into She Who Thirsts' hungry maw. Only a small fraction of the Comorites survived and managed to escape Komarok in time. Led by none other than Azdrabale Vecht, they fled the collapsing realm aboard ships belonging both the Cabals and stolen from the houses, or in the hands of captains who'd abandoned their oaths and now only wanted to escape the hordes of She Who Thirsts. Strangely, these refugees met no opposition from the Horusian warriors who had engineered this apocalypse, and they would go on to become raiders under Vecht's command. Despite their small numbers and lack of a base of operation, they would commit many acts of atrocity in the centuries to come, driven by hatred and a renewed desire to make the entire galaxy bleed. Thus was the fifth price paid by Horus to Slaanesh, as the one who would be called Supreme Overlord of the Drukhari was allowed to escape, his pursuit of power and endless prayer to the Dark Prince. The weapons retrieved from Komarok's vaults before its destruction by Horus' strike force were brought to Melum, where they were studied by the Cabalites of Ahriman in order to unlock their secrets. The knowledge of the Yildari far surpassed even that of the greatest human sorcerer, but Ahriman was certain that he and his brothers could master the truths contained within the alien devices in time, as well as the way to use them when Horus needed them. The humans rescued from the slave pits were also brought to the Sons of Horus' home world. There, they were shown the dark majesty of Horus' dominion, and turned into fanatical devotees of the Prince of the Eye. In the years to come, they would be spread beyond the Eye of Terror, serving as demagogues preaching the greatness of Horus with the fervor of true believers, telling others of how it was the War Master's forces that had rescued them from their Xenos captors, and brought divine retribution upon them, not the servants of the false emperor and his rotten and weak imperium. Meanwhile, though he had failed to seize the Dark City, Horus was still bound by his covenant with Slaanesh to honor the last price he'd promised to pay. In the gene labs of the Horusian Dominion, the fleshsmiths of the 16th Legion crafted a perfect host body, uniquely suited to containing the essence of a powerful daemon without being corrupted and eventually destroyed. All manners of foul sorceries and heretical dark tech were used to make this possible, and the failed attempts had to be purged, sometimes at great cost, as they woke feral and insane, and unleashed the full might of their unshackled psychic potential. But eventually, the fallen apothecaries succeeded, and the host body was brought before the Daemon Prince Shah-Gadhan, the harbinger of all pleasures. Shah-Gadhan was one of Slaanesh's first ascended servants, having done the Dark Prince's bidding when he was yet slumbering in the darkness of the Yildari psyche. His hatred of the children of Isha ran deep, and now, he'd been given the chance to indulge it in full. By possessing the host body provided by Horus, Shah-Gadhan could walk the worlds of men undetected, and turn the enemies of chaos against one another. A Horasian cabal engineered the Harbinger's escape from the Eye through their portals, and provided him with an ironclad false identity within the Imperium's high spheres, with documents and resources to match. Thus was the sixth and final debt of the War Master to the Dark Prince repaid, and its consequences would be most terrible. The damage inflicted to the webway by Comarika's fall had been immense. The craft worlds, which depended on the network to travel the stars, found many of the paths they had used were now lost, destroyed, or flooded with the Neverborn, forcing the urgent sealing of many of their Wraithbone portals lest the craft worlds themselves be invaded by the demonic hordes. Furthermore, the death of so many of their dark kindred had caused some of the craft worlds to reconsider their isolationist policies, and what happened once Shah-Gadhan finished his infiltration of the Imperium would only aggravate the situation. In the decades following his incarnation, Shah-Gadhan drove the vast armies of the Imperium to hunt down the craft worlds. With Comarik destroyed, he argued passionately, now was the time to wipe the foul Xenos from existence completely. After all, how could the Imperium do less than the accursed heretics of the Eye? Since the end of the Great Crusade, the craft worlds had evaded conflict with humanity by remaining beyond the Imperium's reach, but in his obsessive hatred, Shah-Gadhan had learned the location of these hiding places. 6 craft worlds burned at the hands of the Harbinger's dupes over the next 100 years, before the Inquisition realized the true nature of Lord Admiral Victor Eldar Banyuri and killed him, banishing the Daemon Prince and killing thousands of his mind-bound thralls along with him. Even so, what fragile bonds had been forged between individual Imperials and the craft worlds in the struggle against the cults of chaos were sundered by these attacks. From then on, the attitude of the Asuryani would be even more hostile to the Imperium than previously, for the Maquis had proven just how easily they were manipulated by the great enemy. On Biel-Tan in particular, calls began to be heard for the complete extermination of the human race, and it was only because of the impossibility for the remnants of the Yildari Empire to execute it that the idea did not gain too much traction. Besides, the craft worlds were too busy looking to their own defenses, as Slaanesh seemed to have grown bored with toying with them and was driving the rest of his servants to hasten their extinction. Craft world Lugganath was the first victim of this resurgent focus, as Fulgrim himself led a coalition of Emperor's children warband to destroy it completely, claiming the souls of its population for Slaanesh. Exodite worlds were also targeted by Reaver bands operating under the distant control of the Third Legion. Among the remaining Eldars, militarization exploded, the hold of Ka'in on their souls growing stronger with every passing cycle. The twilight of the Eldars, which they had managed to elude for more than 4,000 years, now loomed closer than ever. He was free. Lost in a strange and alien realm, alone and deprived of all but the weapons he had been born with, but free. His captors were dead, though he had been denied the chance to avenge the many wrongs they had done him. They had fed off his pain even as his sons starved them. He knew this, because his tormentors had made sure to tell him with every cut, thinking it would drive him mad. And then, they'd had the audacity to be surprised when he'd laughed in their faces and mocked them for their failures even as their poisoned knives dug deeper into his guts. His sons. They were still out there, he knew, still fighting, though surely all those he'd known must be long dead by now. He had to get back to them. And so Jagatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, began his long trek through the webway, searching for a way home. Chapter 44, The Radiant War. Malum Datum, 444.m35. On the verge of the Eye of Terror, where the light of the Astronomicon met the roiling tides of half-reality of the Great Warp Storm, were the Radiant Worlds. There was the one front of the Long War where deceit, intrigue, and corruption had no place, only the clash of raw, unthinkably powerful psychic energy. The fire tide of the Astronomicon swept over the Radiant Worlds, scorching them clean of life, while the storms of chaos raged against the anathema's brilliance. Of all the powers in the Eye, only one dared to brave the fire tide to bring war to the Emperor's own light, Angren, the Prince of Blood, and the Key-ornate infernal legions that followed in his wake. Since the days of the Broken Conclave, the Daemon Primarch of the World Eaters had waged the Radiant War, a conflict of truly mythical nature and proportions, whose smallest skirmishes made a mockery of the greatest battles of the Horus Heresy. Though he was the most powerful daemon of Khurn involved in the Radiant War, Angren didn't really lead the forces of chaos. His mind had been almost completely destroyed by his ascension on Nuceria and banishment during the Siege of Terra, and the shreds of sanity he'd regained since had been lost during the Broken Conclave. Rather than give commands to the legions of blood, the Daemon Primarch rampaged across the front lines of the war, crushing everything in his path and bellowing his hatred for the father that had denied him death millennia ago. Aside from Khörne's legions of blood, a handful of mortals also fought in the Radiant War. Those of the World Eaters who were most steeped in the warp made pilgrimage to the Radiant Worlds in order to dedicate themselves to this holy crusade against the false Emperor's light, as did especially powerful human and mutant warriors. Such apostles of the Blood God were richly rewarded by their divine patron, granted weapons and armor with which they could fight the angelic hosts of the anathema on equal ground. Alongside the ships of bones and brass that carried the legions of blood from one battlefield to the next sailed a ship that had first been built in the orbital dockyards of sacred Mars itself, the Conqueror, Gloriana-class battleship, and flagship of the 12th Legion. The warship had changed greatly since the start of the heresy. Now it was a terrifying daemon ship, its malevolent sentience fused with the brilliant tactical mind of its former captain, Lodarisarin, the Blood Rose, who sat on her command throne, an accursed eidolon of blood, shadow, and wrath, on the very threshold of full-blown daemonhood herself. Over the centuries, many brave or foolish scholars of ruin had sought to investigate the Radiant Worlds, and the forces of the Astronomicon in particular. Almost none of them had ever returned, consumed by the fire tide or slaughtered by the hordes of Khörne, but some lore about the Emperor's radiant host had still made it back to the other powers of the Eye of Terror. In time, these pieces of knowledge were compiled together by Horician Kabbalites, for the Prince of the Eye was always searching for more information about his father and enemy. The fires of the Astronomicon were powered by the sacrifices of thousands of Psykers, their life force ripped from them in order to keep the great beacon lit so that it might guide the Imperium's ships through the warp. However, the belief of trillions of souls regarding it as the Emperor's light had altered their nature. Thanks to Sanguinius being so prevalent in the theology of the ecclesiarchy, angelic iconography was prominent in most versions of the Imperial Creed, and the hosts of the Astronomicon thus appeared in angelic forms as well, not too different from the way ancient depictions of Hell's denizens had shaped the appearance of the daemons of chaos. The host of the Astronomicon was therefore composed of billions of pure, merciless angels of fire and lightning, driven by holy zeal and hatred of the impure. They flew among the Radiant Worlds or were carried by the ghosts of martyr ships, lost to the warp in the course of their duties to the God Emperor and given a new half-existence in order to prosecute the Radiant War, crewed by faceless ghosts of the Imperial Navy condemned to an eternity of service. Though the angels were entirely devoid of individuality, there were ranks among them, their substance shaped to fit particular purposes in their endless conflict against the legions of chaos. On very rare occasions, a fire-tide angel had been captured by curious sorcerers. Binding them was extremely difficult, as no standard demonology circle could contain them, but with chains forged of infernal steel and drenched in the blood of still-living blanks, they could be contained. Spiritual vivisection had revealed that every angel was composed of the alloyed souls of dead Imperials who had perished with the name of the God Emperor on their lips, their immortal essence claimed by the Astronomicon before being broken apart and remade into these faceless divine warriors. To the traitor legions, this discovery was another proof of the Emperor's lies, and the true nature of his plan for mankind as fodder for his own divine ascension. Many unflattering comparisons were drawn between the so-called God Emperor and the Inferna Astra, whose demonic radiance broke minds and flesh alike to create mindless thralls of the living suns. Out of a dark sense of humor, the Kabbalites decided to use names from the ancient and long-forbidden faiths of old Earth to describe the different types of angelic spirits that made up the host, as one more reminder of the master of mankind's endless hypocrisy. The Seraphim, the most holy, were the generals of the host, its champions and warlords. They were made from the immortal essences of the greatest commanders of the Imperium, Space Marine Praetors, Astra Militarum generals, Imperial Navy admirals, militant cardinals of the ecclesiarchy and the like. Shaped from blinding light into the aspect of many winged angels, they tore through the ranks of the blood legions with impunity and clashed against the bloodthirsters of Khörne, the shockwaves of their duels leveling mountains. The cherubim, the guardians, served as the vanguard and shock troops of the host. In life, they'd been space marines of the loyalist legions, who had died in battle against the enemies of the Imperium. In death, the last trappings of mortality had been stripped from them, replaced by the image of the angels of death the ecclesiarchy had cultivated on a million worlds for generations. They were figures of towering human perfection rendered in lightning and fiery wings, with none of the brutish features that most transhuman warriors possessed, for how could his angels be anything but perfect? The Ophanim, the wheels, were created from the souls of inquisitors and judges. Hooded silhouettes, thin to the point of almost being skeletal, they projected an aura around them that weakened daemons and strengthened the other seraphic spirits, drawn from the holy terror they inspired in the Imperium's entire population. Their name came from how swiftly they could move, not just across a particular battlefield but also between the fronts of the Radiant War, in an echo of the belief that the Ordos and the Arbits were always watching. The Elohim, the powers, were nearly as rare as the Seraphim, for they were forged from the souls of soulbound Imperial Psykers whose spirits had been rescued from the hungry maws of daemons upon their heroic deaths in battle. The fear and hatred of the Psyker shaped them, giving them an eldritch aspect that made them the most terrifying of all the host's angels. Chains of duty hang from their unknowable shapes, the only part of them that could be held in mortal memory for more than a moment. They were the artillery of the host, raining desolation upon demonic hordes from afar. The Malachim, the virtues, made up the rank and file of the host. Each was an amalgamation of the souls of dead soldiers of the Astra Militarum, in the guise of a seraphic spirit with 2 wings of light and a body of silver and gold. Armed with a spear and a shield, they flew in perfect formations, the smallest of which numbered in the thousands, while the greatest could cover entire continents with their massed numbers. They had no fear, no doubt, no ability to disobey the commands of the Seraphim, they had no will, no emotion, no thought. The Imperium's perfect soldiers, fearless and faceless. The Radiant War had raged since the end of the Horus heresy, when the Emperor had been trapped on the Golden Throne by his sons in order to preserve the last guttering spark of his existence. On some of the most violently disputed worlds, entire continents had formed covered in the bones of dead angels and daemons, their essences intertwined and trapped, unable to dissipate. Such was the scale of the divine conflict that it echoed in the dreams of the cults of the World Eaters, showing them a promised afterlife where they would continue the struggle against the very incarnation of the oppression and slavery they fought against in life. Around a century and a half after the ruin of Commeric, however, something happened that changed the course of the Radiant War forever. In the years since the doom of the Dark City, Slaanesh had grown steadily more powerful, digesting the bounty of Drukhari souls and feasting on yet more horrors committed by his followers. This infuriated Khurn, who despised the youngest god above all else save the anathema itself. Though the secession of Pacificus had fueled his own might, and the galaxy echoed with thousands of smaller conflicts which all served him in the end, the Lord of Skulls couldn't let his younger sibling scoring such a blow in the long war go unanswered. And so the god of war had brooded and schemed, for though he was the most direct of the ruinous pantheon, his was all the cunning and imagination with which mortals had killed one another since the dawn of sentient life. A plan was wrought, and enacted. In the Radiant Worlds, the daemon Primarch Angren felt a tug, that became a pull, that became an order. The will of the Blood God was not made clear to him through visions or divine decrees, but by the brutal command of a cruel master to his hunting hound, promising only pain if the hound refused. Once, the very idea would have enraged the Lord of the Red Sands, but by now, all thoughts of rebellion had long been beaten out of the Prince of Blood, who sought only the false solace of slaughter. Now, that futile pursuit was focused on a name, burned into his tormented mind by his divine patron, Imperius, the voice of the Astronomicon. Among the countless, faceless creatures of the host of the Astronomicon, Imperius stood unique in that it appeared to possess sentience and individuality. As the most powerful of the Seraphim, it claimed to speak for the God Emperor, its thunderous voice echoing across entire daemon worlds as it proclaimed the will of its distant master. There was some debate among the scholars of the Eye as to whether Imperius truly was some avatar of the false emperor, a mouthpiece through which he could speak despite being trapped on the Golden Throne, or just one more random manifestation of the fire tide, created by the desperate prayers of the Imperials for their lord to guide them. Angren, however, cared not for such theological debates. Khurn had demanded Imperius' skull, and the daemon Primarch would deliver it to him. The daemon Primarch's aimless rampage had been given a target, and he tore through the ranks of the host like a meteor, sensing the location of Imperius at all times thanks to Khurn's command. Gorefather tore through the ranks of the Malachim, and the Black Blade drank deep of the golden vitae of the cherubim who tried to stop the rampage of the Prince of Blood. Imperius swiftly realized its peril, as well as the opportunity it represented. It withdrew deep in the radiant worlds, not out of cowardice, for it was as unable of fear as any other angel of the Astronomicon, but in order to force Angren to move far beyond the nominal lines of the radiant war. With its voice of golden thunder, Imperium commanded the host to move to cut off Angren and the demonic horde that had managed to follow him off from the rest of the legions of blood. Perhaps in time Angren might have managed to fight his way to Imperius, though the effort would likely have weakened him to the point the voice of the Astronomicon could have defeated him. But Khurn had other plans. In truth, and entirely without his knowledge, Angren had never been anything more than a distraction to draw the attention of the host's commander. From the realm of blood, Khurn sent another agent, one who had spent the last decades, though time meant nothing in the warp, proving his worth in the endless battleground at the foot of the Skull Throne. Drazar, once known as Arera, Phoenix Lord of the Striking Scorpions, then as the executioner of the Incubi Temples, had undergone his third rebirth in the fires of Khurn's domain. The last guttering spark of Asuryan's fire in his soul had been smothered and replaced with the raging inferno of the blood god's power, heralding Drazar's transformation into a daemon prince of Khurn. His aspect was little changed from his days as the executioner, though his black armor was now arterial red, and the skull rune of Khurn was emblazoned in his crested helmet. As Imperius sent more and more of its reserves at Angren in order to defeat him, Drazar struck at Imperius' stronghold from another direction. The Daemon Prince was accompanied by 8 exalted bloodthirsters of Khurn, who shattered the walls of Imperius' fortress and opened the path for him to confront the voice. The ensuing battle was brutal but swift, for Imperius was no martial spirit. Imperius was slain by Drazar, who departed the radiant worlds and returned to Khurn's realm in order to present his enemy's golden skull to his new master. Angren was robbed of his purpose and the tantalizing promise of relief once more, his rage surging even higher in response, and he continued his rampage with renewed vigor, while the host was suddenly deprived of its overall commander, allowing the legions of blood to gain ground. The Radiant War was the greatest of the fronts where the slaves of the Blood God waged the long war. For every victory they scored against the hosts of the Astronomicon resulted in disturbances in the beacon's guiding light. Imperius' death was the single greatest victory won by the champions of Khurn since the conflict's inception, and its consequences were accordingly cataclysmic. The Astronomicon's light weakened across the entire galaxy, with entire sectors being plunged into spiritual darkness as a result. Hundreds of thousands of ships were lost to the warp, tearing apart the fragile web of transportation on which the Imperium's structure rested. Star systems starved, while cut off from the rest of the Imperium and aware of the difficulties its armies would face to reach them, numerous planets rose up against their imperial rulers. Space Marine forces were sent en masse to quell these uprisings, their librarians being somewhat able to guide their ships through the darkness that had befallen the Sea of Souls, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. The century of rebellions had begun, and on his throne of skulls, Khurn beheld the results of his plan and smiled. Chapter 45, The Entropy of Empires. Malum Datum, 587.m35. After the fall of Commeric, Nurgle had considered acting against his youngest sibling in order to destroy the Panacea STC, whose existence was anathema to the grandfather. But after seeing what the minions of the Dark Prince had done with the life-saving technology, he had judged the efforts of his followers were best spent continuing the prosecution of the Long War. The horrors that Slaaneshi cults had wrought using the secrets of the Dark Age would have made even the transhuman techno-overlords of that long-lost age shudder with dread, taking inspiration from the flesh works of the now-extinct homunculi of the Dark City. Mutilated by the loss of an entire segmentum, bleeding from 1,000 rebellions and more, the Imperium still stood, so vast that it could endure such wounds and keep blindly trudging along, like a great, idiotic reptilian beast who didn't even notice the spears plunged into its flanks. The preachers of the Imperial Creed passionately proclaimed that, through the grace of the God Emperor and his angel, the Imperium would stand forever, no matter what the heretics, traitors, and Xenos tried. This offended Nurgle, father of plagues and master of the Garden of Rot. Though those who knew of his existence most feared him for the pestilences he brewed in his great cauldron and that his servants disseminated across the galaxy, the ruinous power was more than a cultivator of disease. Nurgle's domain was decay, the inevitable entropy that claims all things as seen through the fearful eyes of mortal souls. Sickness was but one aspect of this, though the greater one due to the depths of emotional torment endured by those whose flesh failed them and who could feel death drawing closer with every feverish nightmare, every weakening heartbeat. Yet even if they were Nurgle's favorite tool, plagues were still just that, a tool. The grandfather could be as subtle as his hated rival Tsianch when the mood took him, and far less prone to overcomplicated schemes that pitted his followers against each other to see which one came out on top. This was not out of love, as so many cultists had deluded themselves, but apathy. Nergal only cared that the job got done, not who did it, and had no patience for infighting among the slaves who bore his threefold mark upon their soul. While the Death Guard sponsored cults that outwardly preached unity and brotherhood against the Imperium's oppression, Nergal had other agents moving within the shadows of the corpse god's kingdom. They sought not to spread plague and worship of the grandfather, but to erode the very foundations of the Imperium. In time, every empire fell, no matter how powerful. Even the Yildari Empire, which had ruled the galaxy for millions of years, had succumbed to entropy in the end. Unlike the Yildari Empire, however, the Imperium couldn't be allowed to create a warped god when it collapsed. The threat of the eternal tyrant which had pushed the dark gods to change their plans at the height of the heresy and prevent the death of Horus was still present, and Nergal had dedicated a great deal of effort in preventing the birth of this abomination. To that end, Nergal intended to wield a particular weapon that had been the bane of tyrannical empires since the days of the old and ruthless Necrontyr dynasties, the truth. The monumental edifice of the Imperium was built on a foundation of secrets and lies. Long before the dark gods had put their hooks into Horus' soul in the Davan system, the Emperor and his servants had worked tirelessly to conceal the reality of the cosmos from the people they had conquered, under the guise of the so-called imperial truth. The Lord of Decay saw great irony in using those same secrets to help hasten the inevitable collapse of the Anathema's kingdom, and guided his followers in ferreting out these hidden mysteries. Again and again, the disciples of Nergal were foiled, their efforts discovered by the Inquisition before they were put to the pyre. Yet the Dark God wasn't discouraged, for in this as in all things, time was on his side. Eventually, his agents would succeed, it was only a question of how much time and how many attempts it would take. Such was the true terror of decay, and if any inquisitors suspected it, they kept silent, having long known that the war against chaos couldn't be won, only fought. These efforts at unearthing the truths that the Imperium sought to conceal had been going on since the end of the heresy, a front of the long war where engagements weren't fought on the battlefield but in ancient archives and shadowy corridors, not with bolter and chain sword but with dagger and poison. Entire cults had been founded and wiped out, and several inquisitorial cabals had been founded for the sole purpose of preventing their efforts. Whenever one of the Plague Father's agents succeeded in obtaining evidence of one of the Imperium's dirty secrets, the Inquisition reacted by purging everyone involved along with everyone who might have been passed the information. Imperial organizations, cities, and even a couple of worlds had been destroyed in this way, and while this was a victory in itself for chaos, it did little to advance the greater goals of Nergal in the Long War. The Septarchy of Revelation, the Brotherhood of Truth, the Seekers of the Unknown, the Revolutionary Committee of Aegaria Primus, all of them and many more tried to expose the Imperium's lies, and all were destroyed along with their associates, friends, and families. Still, Nergal persevered, uncaring of the losses incurred and knowing that he only needed to get lucky once to cause irreparable damage to the Imperium. And so, as the 6th century of the 35th millennium neared its end and the God of Decay watched as his servants made one more attempt at uncovering the secrets of the Imperium of Man, he felt neither anticipation nor excitement, merely putting his metaphysical hand on the scales of chance as he'd done many times before. As before, this was a long shot, but the Plague Father was willing to play those odds. At first, it seemed like another failure, an infiltration of an inquisitorial archiving facility that was discovered as the operatives breached the cogitator banks, leading to their slaughter. However, their meddling still had consequences. Months later, an Imperial savant accessed the records on behalf of their master. They had all appropriate authorizations, and the knowledge they sought was entirely mundane, tangentially related to an ongoing investigation. But the damage done during the failed infiltration to the antique and ill-understood archiving mechanisms caused a glitch, and along with a list of citizens having made the trip to Illicar Secundus in the last decade, the savant received a file that had been locked deep within the archive's most secure records. By the time the savant realized the error, they had also realized that reporting it would lead to their mind-scrubbing at best. For the file was a report compiled millennia ago, in the twilight years of the Scouring. It told the story of the Iron Hands, the cold and merciless 10th Legion of the Asteroutes. Within it was the tale of how the Iron Hands had been broken by the death of Ferrus Manus on Istvan V, how the Shattered Legion had fought during the heresy, and how its leaders had ultimately turned their back on the Imperium. How they had abandoned the one who sought to bring them to Terra to join the defenders of the throne world, one Shadrach Medusan, leaving him to die at the hands of the sons of Horus. How they had fled from the civil war, with only a few scattered groups of Iron Hands making it to the throne world on their own. And how, after the traitor legions had been defeated at the cost of the Emperor's mortal shell, Robert Guilliman had bribed them into rejoining the Imperium with the skull of their Primarch, reclaimed from Horus' flagship in the final hours of the siege of Terra. However accidental the access had been, the savant knew it had been recorded, and judging by the importance of the information within, surely some kind of warning must have been sent. Their unwilling sin would be discovered, and they were filled with dread and a low anger at the injustice of their fate and the dark secret they had learned. The Iron Hands had served as the crushing fist of the Imperium for thousands of years, yet they had abandoned it in its hour of greatest need. And clearly they still weren't trusted, for the file also contained suggestions for how to best use its contents to force the Iron Hands into compliance with the threat of exposure. With their faith shaken and the certitude of their doom hanging over them, the savant fled from their post, using their training and resources to fake their death and build a new identity on a remote Imperial world. There they remained for several years, living a quiet and peaceful life as an antiquarian working for the local nobility, until they were invited to lend their expertise to an auction of rare items. Among these items was a picture and a collection of notes held in stasis, which were the work of none other than Euphrates Keeler, the legendary saint and founder of the Imperial Creed. It was believed to be a priceless relic of the saint's early life as a remembrancer of the Great Crusade, even if the image's subject was hidden by its position face down in the stasis field. However, the image was that of Horus Lupercal, taken before, or perhaps after, his fall to the ruinous powers. The Inquisition had tracked it for centuries, and the auction was attacked by stormtroopers under the command of the Ordo Hereticus, only to find themselves opposed by members of the Congregation of Illumination, another Nergalite cult of revelation. Amidst the chaos, the savant ended up with the Keeler image and the saint's writings in their possession as they fled the carnage. When they dared to inspect their prize, they immediately recognized the image of the War Master, but the writings were what was truly important. In them, the saint told of how the Imperial Creed had come to exist. It hadn't, as the ecclesiarchy claimed, sprung into existence out of acknowledgement of the Emperor's obvious divinity. The master of mankind had insisted that he was not a god, and that humanity had no need for religion of any kind in the Imperium he envisaged. Instead, the faith had grown as a terrified response to the horrors of the warp unleashed by the heresy. As daemons had been revealed to exist despite the claims to the contrary of the imperial truth, humanity had desperately sought a benevolent god to protect them, and thrust that role upon the emperor. It was as the savant was left reeling by this revelation that, guided by the dark god who truly owned their souls, survivors of the Congregation of Illumination found their home. Caught in their indignation and blind to the spiritual rot afflicting their visitors, the savant agreed to join their crusade for truth against the Imperium's lies. Sharing what they knew of the Iron Hands, and finally unburdening themselves in the process, resulted in them gaining great prestige within the group, even if they chose to keep that truth and that of the Keeler's writings secret for now. All members of the congregation knew they'd have only one chance to expose the lies of the Imperium. It was all but certain that the oppressor's retribution would kill them. Half-formed rumors and whispers brought the congregation to the kingdom of Ultramar next. For all of the prosperity of the 500 worlds, Guilliman's involvement in the return of the Iron Hands suggested a dark side to the subordinate realm. The 13th Legion still hadn't fully recovered from its losses against the Necrons of the Pale Wasting and the fall of its Primarch, and there was civil unrest all the way to Macrage, kept alive by the distant support of the traitor legions, though the Savant and their allies knew nothing of this. After several months of cautious observation, planning, and infiltration, all of which done with the unseen assistance of Nergal, who saw promise in the Savant, a single volume was recovered from the fortress of Hera. Within that book was recorded the story of Imperium Secundus, Guilliman's great sin during the heresy. It spoke of the Battle of Kelth, of the ruin storm which had cut off Ultramar from the rest of the galaxy, of the Shadow Crusade which had bled it. It spoke of how, believing the Emperor dead and Terra lost to Horus, Guilliman had declared the founding of Imperium Secundus in Ultramar, and how the Primarch of the Dark Angels, they of ever doubtful allegiance, had joined him when he'd reached Makraj, somehow sailing through the warp storms freely. And then, with merciless clarity, the book told how Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, had been crowned Emperor Regent of Imperium Secundus, head of the Triumvirate. The reveal that even the great angel had taken part in this heresy completely shattered any faith in the Imperium the savant still had left. They were consumed by bitterness and despair, and as they wallowed in misery, the dark god of decay reached out and claimed their soul, marking them as one of his champions. Despair was transmuted into a cold determination to see the Imperium crumble for all its lies. With the blade of truth, they would strike at the whole corrupt edifice that had enslaved the galaxy with a web of deceit meant to preserve the position of the powerful and crush the rest of the species underfoot. The three secrets already stored in the savant's augmented mind were great ones, but they weren't enough. In the decades that followed, the Congregation of Illumination scoured the galaxy for more evidence of the Imperium's lies, making sure to leave backups of their discoveries with clues leading to them for others to follow should they fail and perish. In the Diomat system, they uncovered evidence that Lionel Johnson had given to Perturabo the siege weapons of the system's Forge world, leading to their use on Istvan V. In the depths of a space hulk infested with RAC-GOL, they found a recording of Horus offering STC templates to the Fabricator General of Mars in exchange for his support in Horus Rebellion. From the cold dead hands of a rogue traitor, they pulled an antique copy of the Lectitio Divinitatis signed by its author, Lorgar Aurelian. And, on the backwater world of Ironsol V, they recorded the bestial rage and bloodthirst of the Blood Angels as they fought against the Orcs of Wyok. Stars Masha. All of these secrets nested within the savant's mind. Their weight in their soul acted as a lodestone, drawing in the warp. With every day, the strength of their soul fire grew, and they gained new psychic abilities related to breaking away the veils of deceit and obfuscation that concealed unwanted truths. The congregation grew into an army of cultists and revolutionaries from a variety of worlds and creed, united under the banner of the heretic savant. Together, this ragtag army boarded an astropathic void station in the crossroads system of Melisandre in the year 587. M35. There, the savant-turned-warlord joined their mind with the astropathic choirs and broadcast all the secrets they had learned into the ether, along with every piece of evidence that could be sent this way. At the same time, their associates broadcast the information by more mundane ways across the rest of the Melisandre system, uploading it to the noosphere of the local Mechanikus and shouting it on unencrypted Vox frequencies. Hundreds of worlds received the astropathic communication, and anti-imperial movements seized it for their own ends, spreading it even further. While it wasn't as widespread as the infamous proclamation of Horus, there would be no stopping these claims from circulating, and their bitter truth gave them an edge in the warp, pushing more souls to accept them. This came to be called the Hour of Revelation, and as Nurgle watched with a smile, the god of decay rewarded the one who had started it richly indeed. As scores of rebellions erupted and the stability of the Imperium was shanked with the metaphysical equivalent of a rusted knife covered in poison, the former inquisitorial savant was granted the honor of daemonhood. In a single moment of ascension, all traces of their mortal identity were wiped out, from the memories of the companions who had fought alongside them as part of the Congregation of Illumination to the sealed records of the Inquisition. Now and forever, they would only be known as Nazgul, the entropy of empires, Daemon Prince of Nurgle. From within the warp, Nazgul became a patron of truth seekers, encouraging others to follow in his footsteps and bring down the powerful by revealing their secrets. Of all the slaves of the false emperor, Nazgul despised the Inquisition the most, driven by memories of their mortal life. They would rarely enter the Matorium, and then only for short periods of time, bestowing boons upon their followers or granting them some other assistance before returning to the realms of chaos before they could be banished by the Imperium's daemon hunters. Nazgul's ascension shook the Imperium from top to bottom, in a variety of ways that mirrored the various secrets they had revealed. The Ecclesiarchy reacted to the Hour of Revelation by doubling down on its fanaticism and firebrand rhetoric. The slightest whisper of sedition, doubt, or protest against the cruelty of living conditions was met with lynching mobs driven into a holy frenzy by threats of eternal damnation. As unrest spread and more rebellions popped up, the agents of the Ordo Hereticus were forced to redouble their efforts to keep the fragmenting Imperium together, even as the Ordos themselves were left reeling and fractured by the secrets that had been exposed. With their shameful past exposed, the Iron Hands refused to serve as the Inquisition's mailed fist any longer, withdrawing the bulk of their forces to Medusa in order to debate how they should act in the future. Only a handful of the legion's commanding officers had been aware of the Iron Hand's ancient sin, but now all sons of Pharis Manus knew it. Learning that the Dark Angels were partly to blame for his son's slaughter on the black sands of Istvan V drove Corvus Corax into a bleak melancholy, especially after he had sacrificed so much to save the First Legion from the consequences of its own folly during the second fall of Caliban. While the Raven Lord didn't blame the angels penitent for their Primarch's mistake, none of them had seen Perturabo's treachery coming, for they had all been new to betrayal in those days. This still added to the tension between the loyalist legions that the reveals of the Iron Hand's actions and, more importantly, the existence of Imperium Secundus, had created. Only a handful outside of the 9th Legion had known of the Red Thirst, though there had been plenty of rumors, and combined with the fact that, however shortly, Sanguinius had once claimed the title of Emperor, the reputation of the Blood Angels took a hit. No longer were they guaranteed to be welcomed as saviors by the population of imperial worlds they came to assist. It was no sudden, cataclysmic collapse, but the foundations of the Imperium had been eroded, and would continue to suffer as the truth spread and more imperial citizens were infected with the poison of doubt. After thousands of years of failures, Nergal's long-running plan had finally succeeded, as he had always known it would, in the end. Entropy, in the end, was inevitable. Chapter 46, The Festival of Transcendent Souls. Malum Datum, 189.m36. In the Eye of Terror, there was an apothecary who had once been of the 17th Legion, the Word-Bearers. He had fought in the Great Crusade, and spread the worship of the Emperor to isolated human worlds. Then he had been made to kneel in the ashes of Monarchia, like so many of his brothers, and learned that the Emperor was not a god deserving of worship. Later, he had learned the primordial truth, and risen in rebellion against the deceiver on the Golden Throne in order to bring ascension to humanity. He had fought hard, and made bargains to survive that had deprived him of his very name. But the rebellion had failed, and he had been forced into exile along with his brothers. Then he had realized the truth, that the gods had lied. They would not, could not, deliver humanity the transcendence they had promised. The gift of daemonhood was only ever bestowed upon their favored champions, and they were merely toys, pawns to use in the endless games the gods played against one another. Through his investigation, the Unfettered had come to believe that the ascension to daemonhood had very stringent requirements, beyond the mere whims of the chaos gods, though he also believed both interpretations to be correct, being different approaches to a concept that was beyond mortal minds. It was the Unfettered's belief that, through careful psychic and physical attuning, a mortal soul could be made fit for daemonhood, needing only enough warp energy to trigger the infernal transfiguration. All that remained was finding a way to achieve this. Such a belief was entirely antithetical with the dark creed of the 17th Legion. And so, the apothecary who was now called the Unfettered had broken away from the word of Lorgar. He had become a heretic, seeking a way to steal apotheosis from the divine. As he pursued his blasphemous research, he realized that without the name he had given up, the dark gods of chaos could no longer affect him directly, which he suspected was the only reason they hadn't struck him down yet. But just because they couldn't destroy him outright didn't mean they couldn't send their myriad servants after him. Members of his old legion tracked him wherever he went, and aspiring champions of the ruinous powers were given quests by their dark patrons promising great rewards in exchange for his death. Yet the Eye of Terror was large, with plenty of places to hide, and the Unfettered was skilled enough to elude or kill these pursuers so far, but not to prosper. The Unfettered needed allies, both to protect him and to help him in his research, but he didn't know where to turn. He knew how seemingly impossible his goal was, and the other powers of the Eye were unlikely to spend resources on what looked like a guaranteed failure. Even should someone believe in his research's potential, they would merely attempt to use it for their own ends rather than use it to drag humanity toward what the fallen apothecary saw as its manifest destiny. Fortunately for him and unfortunately for the Imperium, he found such allies in the end, and to his immense surprise, there were members of his gene line among them. Yet this was nothing compared to the shock he felt when he saw their leader, Mariana, the prophetess whose words had broken Lorgar Aurelian's resolve and ended the Legion Wars. As the witch approached the Unfettered's field laboratory on the war-torn daemon world of Eidolon, she was accompanied by none other than Kairos Fateweaver, the Oracle of Tzientch, who had set Lorgar on his path to rebellion and roused Horus Lupercal from his death-like slumber from the injuries he had sustained at the siege of Terra. How the two had come together, the Unfettered didn't know, but as he heard Mariana's offer, he soon didn't care. Somehow, Mariana had learned of the Unfettered's research, and claimed that it aligned with her own goal of ushering in humanity's ascension as masters of the warp. As for Kairos, the Oracle's two heads gave contradicting but equally plausible answers whenever he was questioned as to his motives. One said he was there to ensure the Unfettered's research succeeded and ushered in a new age of demonic supremacy across the galaxy, while the other said that the Unfettered's failure would help bring about the end of the Long War. Regardless, Kairos' power and influence in the warp made his help too valuable to discard, and, as Mariana later explained to the Unfettered in private, turning on the Oracle would result in a battle they weren't sure they could win. The Unfettered accepted the witch's proposal and joined her. Together, the Dread Triumvirate traveled to Aftermath, the city of cities, aboard the cruiser Ash Drinker, which served as flagship of Mariana's warband, and had changed much since it had been gifted to her by Lorgar along with her guard of legionaries. In Aftermath, they met with the exiled masters of the Forge, and after many, many days of negotiations, received priceless knowledge from the one named Master Lore. What they gave in return, what promises they made, none but the Triumvirate would ever know. With that knowledge, the Unfettered's research advanced considerably, but the anarchic nature of the Eye of Terror made it unsuitable for further experimentation. There were places of relative stability in the Eye, but those were some of the most ferociously fought for locations, and the warband was far too small to lay claim to one of them. The next step of their plan would have to take place beyond the Eye. With the guidance of the Fate Weaver, the Ash Drinker was able to depart the Eye of Terror and slip past the Imperium's defenses without being detected. At first, the Unfettered suggesting sailing for Segmentum Pacificus, the independent kingdoms that had grown in the wake of the Sundering would surely be easily tempted by the prospect of demonic ascension, once properly rephrased. But Kairos objected, one head claiming that the Horusians kept too close an eye on the region while the other swore that they couldn't possibly fight their way through the Imperial blockade and other perils that guarded the way to the Sundered Kingdoms. Therefore, the Ash Drinker remained in Segmentum Obscurus, and the Unfettered resumed his experimentations with the assistance of the other two members of the Triumvirate. Finding volunteers was easy, selecting worthy applicants from among them was more difficult. But those were nothing compared to the difficulty of the process itself. For several decades, they remained unsuccessful, and their failures would become legends in their own right. The child beasts of Sanguiterra, the whispering horrors of Belizar, and the screaming code of Lucius, all were created as byproducts of the Unfettered's unholy research. But eventually, through thousands of ghastly experiments, the process was refined, and the first artificial daemon princes, called the Transcendent Ones, were created. Only a couple of these abominations against the God Emperor and the Dark Gods both were crafted from the burning souls of willing subjects pursuing power no matter the cost, but that was enough to prove that the process could be performed semi-reliably. Usurpation is the one path to true power. The Unfettered. The Triumvirate knew that their activities would soon draw attention, and that unless they had overwhelming power on their side, they would be destroyed and their research either stolen or destroyed. They needed to create more Transcendent Ones, enough that they would be able to face off against any force dispatched against them. To that end, they devised a large-scale ritual that would allow the simultaneous creation of multiple Transcendent Ones. They called it the Festival of Transcendent Souls, and at the suggestion of Kairos Fate Weaver, they selected the imperial world of Dimamar as the place the festival would take place. With the two existing Transcendent Ones, who had claimed the names of Gog and Magog out of one of Old Earth's ancient religions, leading the way, the Triumvirate's warband descended upon Dimamar. Its defenders were taken completely by surprise, and were slaughtered with contemptuous ease, allowing the Triumvirate to seize control of the planet and start preparations for the festival within weeks of their arrival in the system. Dimamar's population was enslaved and put to work building great monuments engraved with eldritch runes all across its surface, while the Unfettered and his acolytes scoured the billions of men and women to find suitable candidates. By the standards of the Imperium in that age of oppression and ruthlessness, Dimamar had been a pleasant and peaceful enough planet, but the Long War had reached even there, planting the seeds of doubts and resentment. Many candidates were found, and by the time the material preparations for the festival were completed, dozens of them had survived the preliminary examinations, trials, and procedures. The Unfettered had studied each of them in detail, and tuned the process to the variations in their souls to maximize their odds of success. As the Triumvirate had foreseen, however, they would not be allowed to proceed with their plans unopposed. On the distant moon of Titan, in the Sol system, the prognosticators of the Grey Knights, that mysterious order of space marines tasked with hunting the demonic wherever it dared to invade the Emperor's domain, had sensed the festival's echoes through time. Even with veteran diviners had found it difficult to make sense of their visions, for the Unfettered's research was something none of them had ever even considered possible, but they knew enough to send the full strength of their chapter to stop the Festival of Transcendent Souls. And so, in the year 189.M36, the warp around Dimamar tore open to reveal the fleet of the Grey Knights, gathered in numbers not seen since the heresy. Leading them was none other than Janus, the Supreme Grand Master of the chapter. Sensing the festival in progress, the Grey Knights immediately landed in force, divided into several task forces targeting the ritual sites that formed a continent-sized source rouse pattern on the planet's surface. Janus himself led the spearhead aimed at the greatest ritual, where the Triumvirate themselves were overseeing the transcendence of no less than 13 candidates. Mariana's sorcery had enslaved and twisted the remaining population of Dimamar, turning them into mutants and demented cultists who hurled themselves at the Grey Knights in their tens of thousands, giving their lives to slow the Silver Warriors enough for their masters to complete their foul work. Every step the Sons of Titan took was steeped in the blood of formerly loyal Imperial subjects, and the slaughter combined with the rituals to thin the veil between the Materium and the Immaterium, fueling the festival as more warp energy became available to transform the candidates. In several places, the Grey Knights arrived in time to prevent the transcendence from taking place, while in others, they had to fight the newly transformed eldritch demigods created by the Triumvirate. This was the case in the main site, located in what had once been the planetary capital. There, no less than 8 of the 13 candidates managed to survive the process and avoid the utter destruction of their not-so-immortal souls by the terrible energies involved in the transcendence process. What followed was a battle beyond description. As the Grey Knights drew upon their own psychic might to match that of the Transcendent Ones, reality buckled and cracked, letting yet more daemons into the Materium. If not for the fact that the Neverborn attacked the Transcendent Ones just as readily as they did the Grey Knights, the Imperial champions would have been overwhelmed. Amidst the madness, the Unfettered fell, slain by daemons whose shapes defied comprehension and classification. His soul slipped from his ravaged corpse and, nameless, fell into the Empyrean, shielded from the claws of the Neverborn by his lack of an identity for them to hunt. Janus himself perished as well, fighting Gog and Magog on his own after having been separated from his personal guard. When the Grey Knights found their Supreme Grand Master, he was dying, but the first 2 Transcendent Ones had been defeated, banished screaming to the warp. His body was recovered and brought back aboard their ships, to await transfer and burial on Titan. Eventually, after days of fighting as brutal as any that had taken place since the last hours of the Siege of Terra, the Grey Knights were victorious, though it had cost them over 2/3 of their number. The last of the Transcendent Ones brought into existence on Dimamar was destroyed, and the cultist hordes were slain. Before leaving the system, the Grey Knights made sure that no trace of the Unfettered's heresy was left behind. Their ships burned Dimamar to cinder, wiping out the entire surviving human population. Only then did the Sons of Titan leave, knowing that the hunt for the rest of the Cabal was only beginning. For though the Unfettered had perished and Kairos Fateweaver had disappeared at some point during the battle, Mariana had escaped with what remained of her warband, returning to the Ash Drinker before departing Dimamar, the ship's infernal enhancements enabling it to avoid the guns of the Grey Knights' fleet. In the years that followed, Mariana spread the knowledge of the transcendence process far and wide, though none would ever match the Unfettered's mastery. Without the Word-Bearer's expertise, another festival was impossible, but countless heretics sought to use the rights to claim the power of daemonhood for themselves, unaware that such power came at a cost, for no defeated Transcendent One, not even Gog and Magog, the first and greatest of their kind, ever returned to the Materium, their essences having been seized by the dark gods upon their arrival into the realms of chaos and subjected to a fate best not thought of. An age of war and madness descended upon Segmentum Obscurus, as newly ascended Transcendent Ones rallied armies around them and waged war against the Imperium. The legions Asteroutes were forced to direct the bulk of their forces to Segmentum Obscurus, along with countless billions of Imperial Guardsmen and other forces, putting an end to any hope of reclaiming Segmentum Pacificus. These conflicts would be called the Ascension Wars, and would draw even the Primarch Sanguinius, whose sight had been blinded to what had transpired on Dimamar by Kairos machinations. The Great Angel fought across Segmentum Obscurus, often alongside the Grey Knights, whose involvement in the Ascension Wars was so intense that they were forced to abandon their usual protocols of purging those they fought alongside. There was simply no point to their secrecy any longer, not when they had been dragged into such an open battle. And in the realms of chaos, sat on its throne in the court of change, Tzeentch laughed with 1,001 mouths, as Kairos Fate Weaver bowed before the Architect of Fate and, on Terra, a man named Goj Vandir took up the mantle of Master of the Administratum. Chapter 47, The Reign of Blood. Malum Datum, 200.m36. In the Eye of Terror, news of the Ascension Wars were met with a mix of disbelief, outrage, and glee. The word-bearers were enraged at this blasphemy, performed by one of their own gene line no less. But Mariana remained protected by Lorgar's word, and the Unfettered Soul eluded all attempts by the 17th sorcerers to summon it back from the Empyrean for punishment. The rebellions she left in her wake, however, were not part of that arrangement, and so the Dark Council, ruling body of the word-bearers in the Daemon Primarch's absence, activated many assets in Segmentum Obscurus to destroy the Transcendent Ones and the heretical lore that had created them. Operatives that had infiltrated the Ecclesiarchy rallied the hordes of the Imperial faithful, making great speeches decrying the monstrosity of the Transcendent Ones, describing them as heretics who had destroyed their own immortal souls to gain power for their selfish ends. The Dark Council also sent many Diabolists and Chaos Marines through warp portals. These kill teams targeted the Transcendent Ones who successfully performed the ritual, destroying their incarnated forms and sending them to the Dark Gods for punishment. In an ironic turn of fate, some of these kill teams disguised themselves as loyalist Space Marines, fighting side by side with faithful Imperial citizens against the rebellious allies of the Transcendent Ones so that they might reach their true targets. Meanwhile, the other factions of the Eye of Terror took action as well. Through their cults and rebel cells, they obtained copies of the Unfettered's incomplete research which Mariana had spread throughout the Segmentum. Of course, unlike the fools taking part in the Ascension Wars, they knew very well the doom that awaited the so-called Transcendent Ones upon being banished to the warp, so none of them attempted to perform the rituals themselves, but the insights into the nature of the warp and its relation with the human soul were greatly valued in and of themselves. In research facilities across the Eye, the Unfettered's work continued, though with different goals. An interesting approach to be sure, even if it only leads to an evolutionary dead end. I would have liked to speak with that colleague of mine. Among Lorgar's zealots, he might have actually had something of worth to bring to my great work. It's a shame he died, but then, genius always breeds jealousy. I'll honor his memory by making sure not to share his doom. Fabius Bile, the primogenitor, on the subject of the Transcendent Ones. One of the flashpoints of the Ascension Wars was Medusa, homeworld of the Iron Hands, in Segmentum Obscurus. The Hour of Revelations had caused the 10th Legion to withdraw from the rest of the Imperium, but the many atrocities they had committed in the Inquisition's service hadn't been forgotten. A coalition of Transcendent Ones and their followers attacked Medusa, and while their first assault was repelled, the entire system soon found itself under siege by rebel armies and their demigod leaders. This at least ended the debates and feuds that had divided the Iron Tenth since the Hour of Revelations, as all efforts were focused on defending their home world. The Ascension Wars raged on, threatening to consume the entirety of Segmentum Obscurus. Thousands of worlds were thrown into war, and the Imperium was forced to pour more and more resources into fighting the rebels as well as the opportunistic Xenos raiders and would-be conquerors taking advantage of the confusion. The chaotic factions also made sure to fan the flames whenever they seemed to die down, ensuring that the wars would be as long and painful for the Imperium as possible. But not even Horus himself could have guessed just how damaging they would prove to be in the long run. 6 years after the Festival of Transcendent Souls, the tides of violence reached the imperial world of Caldera. Caldera's people lived modest lives as denizens of a feudal world, and had remained untouched by Horusian schemes, but now their planet became a battleground between the Transcendent Ones and the Imperial forces, each fighting to deny the planet to the other. In truth, There was little reason for the conflict to take place there beyond Caldera's convenient location at a crossing of several warp corridors, making it suitable as a staging ground. The moment word of Caldera's plight reached Terra, Fukin took action. When the Primarch had brought Caldera under the Imperial Aegis during the Great Crusade, he'd made a promise that he would protect its people, out of the guilt he'd felt for his actions during the conquest. Fukin called his legion to his side, summoning the might of the Salamanders to battle once more. Since the heresy, Fukin had remained on Terra, helping rebuild it in the wake of the disastrous siege and slowly regaining the trust of its people, whose very souls had been marked with transhuman dread by the siege's unrestrained violence and horror. Thanks to his efforts and those of his sons, humanity's brutalized home world had begun to recover from the wounds inflicted by Horus and his cohorts. Meanwhile, the Salamanders had rebuilt their numbers, drawing on the blood of their Primarch to replenish their stores of gene seed. On Nocturne, the Legion's home world in Ultima Segmentum, thousands of promising children had been inducted into the Legion's ranks. A great host mustered in answer to the call of the Lord of Drakes, with the High Lords placing considerable resources under his command in the hope that these reinforcements would be enough to turn the tide in Segmentum Obscurus. And so, the 18th Primarch and his legion departed Holy Terra to honor a vow made in another, more innocent, if still gilded with comforting lies and damning ignorance, age. Not only did the Primarch intend to rescue Caldera's people, he was also determined to put an end to the Ascension Wars once and for all. It was a mistake Fukin would live to regret, for there was a serpent on Holy Terra that was now free to strike in the absence of the throne world's mightiest protector, Goj Vandir, the current master of the Administratum. Since the hour of revelations in 587.m35, the Ecclesiarchy had increased its pressure on the Imperium even more. The Ecclesiarch of the time, Grigor XI, had been forced to use exceptional measures in order to enforce the hold of the Imperial Creed, ultimately leading to his assassination by his disgruntled opponents within the Ecclesiarchy itself. In the centuries since, the Ecclesiarchy had tightened its grip on the soul of humanity further and further with each successive Ecclesiarch. Any deviation from orthodoxy was punished by death, even as the sheer size of the Imperium meant that new interpretations of the Imperial Creed inevitably appeared on isolated worlds as fast as the Ecclesiarchy could put them down. As the Ecclesiarchy's power grew, so did its corruption. Enormous tithes were raised to finance the construction of ever more grandiose palaces and monuments, with the cardinal world of Ophelia 7 in particular becoming known as the richest planet in the entire Imperium bar Holy Terra and Mars themselves. It was said that the palaces of Ophelia 7 rivaled the Imperial Palace in size, if not in magnificence, for the techniques by which the master of mankind's resting place had been erected had long since been lost, with only Rogaldorn still remembering them. Though the Ecclesiarchy was vital in maintaining the unity of the Imperium against the heretics of the Eye, its growing influence raised concerns in the highest spheres of power. The tributes and tithes it demanded were also starting to be considered excessive even by the standards of the High Lords, who decided the fate of entire star systems every day. Therefore, when the high-ranking Administratum adept Goj Vandir of the wealthy and powerful Vandir clan plotted to ensure the rise of the weak-willed Paulus III to the position of Ecclesiarch following the suspicious death of the previous incumbent, he was met with little opposition from the other movers and shakers of the Imperium. It was the hope of the other High Lords that Paulus III would be easily manipulated, allowing them to curtail the power of the Adeptus Ministorum and restoring a measure of balance to the delicate equilibrium of imperial high politics. When Vandir took up the mantle of 361st Master of the Administratum, his ascension was once again accompanied by the strange demises of several of his rivals, but such was hardly unheard of on Holy Terra. Indeed, it was considered a mark of one's ability for intrigue. Vandir had taken care to appear to be a staunch opponent of the Ecclesiarchy's dominance while also maintaining the image of an impeccably pious servant of the God Emperor, desiring only that the Ministorum focus on its duties as shepherds of his flock instead of scheming to accrue material wealth and power. But this was only a mask, carefully crafted to conceal his true ambitions. In 200.m36, several years after Fukin and the Salamanders had left Terra and joined the Ascension Wars, Vandir finally made his move. At the head of a group of Astra Militarum officers and Administratum enforcers, he stormed the Ecclesiarchal Palace and confronted Paulus III. Accusing the very Ecclesiarch he had placed on the throne of being a heretic and blaming him for the disquiet and heresy that ran rampant throughout the Imperium, He personally shot the man to death and seized control of the ecclesiarchy through what amounted to a military coup. Those who opposed his takeover within the Terran ecclesiarchy were promptly rounded up by Van Dyer's agents, and within a few weeks of Paulus III's death Van Dyer was effectively both master of the administratum and ecclesiarch, holding control of two of the Imperium's most powerful institutions. With such power at his command, Van Dyer's true nature as a megalomaniacal tyrant was soon revealed, and the period that would later be called the Reign of Blood began. He cemented his control of the ecclesiarchy through bloody purges, including the destruction of entire hive cities and even planets in order to suppress all opposition to his rule. Van Dyer ordered that his every word be recorded for posterity, and seemed to have convinced himself that the emperor spoke through him, and as such, nothing he did could possibly be wrong, though whether he truly believed this or simply used it to justify his deeds to his followers was and would forever remain unclear. The Ordo Hereticus attempted to curtail Van Dyer's power, but to no avail. Mad or not, Van Dyer was one of the greatest political minds mankind had ever created, and he expertly manipulated things to weaken the Inquisition's influence instead, playing on the revelation of their use of the traitorous Iron Hands since the heresy, as well as subtly shifting the blame for the current state of affairs in Segmentum Pacificus and Obscurus on the self-appointed guardians of the Imperium's purity. The Sundering and Ascension Wars were, Van Dyer claimed, signs that mankind had lost the favor of the God Emperor, and only through unquestioning obedience and devotion to him, his chosen prophet, could the Imperium hope to regain its former glory. Segmentum Solar and Tempestus were bled dry of resources and manpower by ever-growing tithes enacted by the Administratum and Ministorum, which were then sent to support the Ascension Wars or the grandiose monuments to Van Dyer's vanity. Out of fear of the Primarchs, Van Dyer also made sure that none of the four sons of the Emperor who yet remained active, Rogaldorn, Sanguinius, Fucin, and Corvus Corax, learned the truth of the Reign of Blood, keeping them busy with the Ascension Wars and the other perils besetting the Imperium. When news of Van Dyer's ascension and exactions reached him, Horus Lupercal wondered which of the I's factions had sponsored the tyrant's rise. To his surprise, his spies found no sign that any of the chaotic factions had anything to do with Goj Van Dyer, which the Prince of the Eye found hard to believe. Upon questioning greater daemons of each of the dark gods, it appeared not even the ruinous powers had anything to do with the new ecclesiarch's crimes. He'd chosen this bloody path all on his own, and would not let anyone stop him. In time, Van Dyer's network of spies brought him word of a small sect of the Imperial Creed based on San Laer, an agri-world on the edges of Ultima Segmentum, the Daughters of the Emperor. This all-female sect worshipped the God Emperor without question, but had cut ties with the ecclesiarchy in the decades prior to Van Dyer's ascension. Struck by one of his ideas that straddled the line between genius and madness, Van Dyer immediately departed for the remote agri-world. On San Laer, Van Dyer met with the leaders of the Daughters of the Emperor, who, in spite of his overwhelming power, refused to show him fealty, honoring the commands of their forebears who had distanced themselves from the ecclesiarchy. Van Dyer's followers fully expected their lord to command them to slaughter the daughters and put all of San Laer to the torch as an example, but before Van Dyer could answer the insult, both parties were attacked by assassins belonging to a chaos cult of the 17th Legion that had managed to avoid detection on San Laer for generations, but couldn't miss the chance to kill an ecclesiarch. Van Dyer's personal force field protected him from the cultists' pathetic weapons, but to the Daughters of the Emperor, such technology seemed miraculous. After the ambush was defeated, the High Lord led the Daughters into a purge of San Laer, rooting out the cult and burning its members along with 10 times that number of innocent civilians. Van Dyer made sure that the pyres were lit by the Daughters of the Emperor, forging their loyalty to him through shared murder, a tactic he'd used many times before as he sent mobs of fanatics to lynch imperial officials who refused to obey his every order without question, from lowly clerks to governors. When they were done, what remained of San Laer's population was free of heresy, and the Daughters of the Emperor pledged their loyalty to the ecclesiarch who had led them to cleanse the taint that had festered right under their noses, and followed him off-world. With Van Dyer's support, the newly renamed brides of the Emperor expanded their ranks massively, recruiting thousands of young women and indoctrinating them into blind obedience of the ecclesiarch. Mirroring the distantly occupied Space Marine legions, they were armored in ceramite and armed with bolters, and became the most powerful military force under Van Dyer's command, each of them capable of facing an entire squad of guardsmen and emerge victorious so long as she held her faith to the God Emperor and his prophet Van Dyer in her heart. Back when Vandire had killed and usurped Paulus III, there had been genuine support for his actions among the other High Lords and their entourage, both for pragmatic and religious reasons. Now, even the most cold-blooded schemers were starting to have doubts, but it was too late. Vandire's control of the ecclesiarchy was absolute, and he even had his own army of power-armored killing machines to help enforce his will. When the cardinals of the Holy Synod attempted to depose Vandire using ancient laws of the ecclesiarchy that hadn't been used in millennia, the brides of the emperor stormed the ancient building on Terra and slaughtered them all, save for those Vandire had marked as his allies, a number that was much smaller than the actual number of those who hadn't voted against him. We thought we could control him, use him to make the ecclesiarchy into the instrument of order it was supposed to be when it was created. We were wrong. He is a monster, one of our own making, and he will destroy us all as surely as Horus if he is not stopped. From the private writings of Inquisitor Jaeger, Ordo Hereticus, 3 days before his arrest and summary execution by the brides of the emperor for heresy and sedition. The Terran elites, who had lived safe from the wars and rebellions ravaging the Imperium, found themselves trapped, at the mercy of an all-powerful lunatic and his army of fanatical followers. They desperately clung to the familiar, continuing to throw lavish parties despite the threat of a single false step or misspoken word drawing the ire of the Med Tyrant and dooming their entire bloodline to excruciation in the ecclesiarchy's torture chambers. As Vandire descended further and further into madness, Segmentum Solar was subjected to pogroms and horrors of a scale not seen since the heresy, except the reign of blood lasted for decades instead of a mere handful of years. Those heretical organizations that managed to escape the purges took full advantage of the situation by helping refugees flee from Ultima Segmentum, where they spread word of the atrocities inflicted by their Terran overlords to the small, isolated populations where the cults brought them. Even the other High Lords were not beyond Vandire's reach. When the Master of the Astronomicon dared to speak up against Vandire, he was kidnapped and held captive for days by Culex's assassins, whose soul-devouring aura extinguished his psychic power entirely and broke his will, reducing him to Vandire's puppet. The assassins themselves had fallen under Vandire's control when his ally Zaiz Jarek, master of the Collegius Assassins, had killed and replaced the Grand Master of Assassins, succeeding in this plot thanks to the liberal use the High Lords had made of the Officios services over the centuries to quash rebellions having left the organization weakened. Gasta of Hediatrix, the fabricator general of the Adeptus Mechanicus, left Terra soon after Vandire's return with the brides of the Emperor, and remained on Mars, refusing to depart the Red Planet's safety and sending emissaries to attend even his most important duties on the throne world. Hediatrix knew that the Mechanicus was the only power left in Sol that rivaled that of Vandire, and refused to risk falling in the clutches of his insane peer. There remained only one group on Holy Terra able to oppose Vandire's Medreign, the Adeptus Custodes. In another time, perhaps they would have reacted more swiftly, but anomalies had started to manifest in the unthinkably complex machinery of the Golden Throne, following the loss of knowledge required for its maintenance in the aftermath of the Prophet of Cog's departure from the Red Planet. In addition, the Custodes had long grown disillusioned with the Imperium's current state, as their brotherhood still honored the ideals of the Great Crusade, which had been trampled upon in the name of survival. Still, as their informants reported more and more of Vandire's atrocities, the Custodes decided to take action, despite the risk of drawing the attention of the Med Tyrant, for at this point, it was unlikely Vandire would hesitate to attack even the Custodes themselves. Nearly a century had passed since Vandire's ascension when their envoy slipped out of Sol unseen by Vandire's many spies and fled through the warp, bound for Segmentum Obscurus and carrying a message meant for the ears of the Primarch Fukin, whom, perhaps alone of the Emperor's sons, the Custodes genuinely respected. Nazgul saw the ship, so small against the tides of the warp. It was damaged, struggling against the storms. If nothing changed, it would soon be destroyed, and the message it carried would be lost. This displeased the End of Empires, for whom truth and unwelcome revelations were sacrosanct. So the Daemon Prince of Nurgle reached out and pushed the storms aside, clearing the way for the ship to reach its destination. Nazgul could already smell the ashes and devastation that would come as a consequence of its actions, and it smiled. In the decades since Fukin's departure from Terra, the Ascension Wars had almost been brought to a close. Fukin's personality had helped quell rebellions less violently than had become typical for the Imperium, earning him the adoration of entire sectors, and his repeated defeats of the Transcendent Ones in single combat had earned him the title of Imperial Dragon. At several points during the conflict, Fukin had even had the chance to fight alongside his surviving brothers once more, though their duties had soon taken them on separate paths again. Of course, Segmentum Obscurus was far from being at peace, but the threat of the Transcendent Ones at least had been curbed for now. Yet as Fukin reflected on all that had been achieved in the last 100 years, the Custodes' messenger finally found him, and delivered to him the full report compiled by the eyes of the Emperor on what had occurred during the Reign of Blood while he and his sons were off fighting. It had been many centuries since Fukin had been driven to rage, but this revelation was more than enough. The Lord of Drakes immediately set off for Terra, determined to bring the Med High Lord to justice, and woe betide any who stood in his way. Those few souls brave enough to advise caution in the face of Fukin's wrath were ignored, though even in throes of righteous fury the Primarch retained enough of his strategic mind to avoid recalling all of his forces from Segmentum Obscurus. Instead, Fukin left the last battlefields of the Ascension Wars with his elite Pyre Guard, over 1,000 veteran warriors, each clad in master-wrought Terminator armor. Alongside them came an entire Navy battle group and many Astra Militarum regiments, for the messenger had described in no uncertain terms the might Vandir had gathered at his side. Fukin's flagship, the Flame Ra, so named in homage to the Legion's original Gloriana-class battleship, lost in orbit of Istvan V, led this armada of retribution on the way back to the throne world. The fleet sailed through the warp with terrible purpose, and the navigators claimed that it was as if the very tides of the Empyrean were parting before them. Within only a few months of their departure, the fleet emerged in Sol, with Fukin proclaiming his intent for all to hear, all but daring Vandir to try and stop him. To the man calling himself Goj Vandir, I say this: you have betrayed every oath you have ever made, and turned your back on my father, the Emperor. You have perverted his Imperium, and I would call you Horician if I didn't know my fallen kinsman enough to know that even he would be embarrassed to be associated with one such as you. Know that all the power you have bought with the blood of others will not protect you from my wrath, for I am the Emperor's wrath come for you at last, and there is nowhere you can hide that the fires of judgment will not find you. Message of Fukin upon his arrival in the Sol system, 303.M36. For the first time in decades, Vandir knew fear as he saw the Flame Rod approach. Terror pierced the veil of madness, and the High Lord ordered every force under his command to stop the approaching judgment. The vast fleet tasked with Holy Terra's protection had long been suborned to his will, with the officer corps of the Imperial Navy being riddled with his supporters, cruel and vicious men, who didn't hesitate to murder their superiors to climb up the ranks. But the crews of the hundreds of ships were not so easily ordered to open fire on a son of the Emperor, and when the news of Fukin's return had reached Mars, Fabricator General Hediatrix had immediately voiced his support for the Lord of Drake's cause. All across Battlefleet Terra, bridge crews and tech priests mutinied against the servants of Vandir. They weren't always successful, but the chaos they caused was enough to clear Fukin's path to the throne world's orbit. In a flash of teleportation, the Primarch of the Salamanders and 100 of his Pyre Guard made planetfall in the very heart of Vandir's power, the Ecclesiarchal Palace. Guided by intel discreetly provided by the Custodes, Fukin made straight for the Mad Tyrant, ripping through the Frateris Templars who sought to block his path until he finally confronted Vandir, surrounded by a coterie of brides of the Emperor. Driven to new paroxysms of rage by the decadence he'd witnessed on his way to the chamber, Fukin let loose the fullness of his awesome power. The brides were scattered before him like children before a furious father, and within seconds the Primarch towered over Vandir, his crimson glare pinning the man who had orchestrated the death of trillions in place. Then, without giving the High Lord time to try anything, Fukin ignited the gauntlet of the forge mounted on his armor, and burned Vandir to ash, his expression remaining utterly still as the madman finally perished. I don't have time to die. I'm too busy. Last words of Goj Vandir, allegedly. Yet the greatest horror of the Reign of Blood was yet to come. With Vandir's death, Alicia Dominica, leader of the Brides of the Emperor and witness to her liege's fiery demise, plunged headfirst into madness herself. In the throes of her delusions, she denounced Fukin and his salamanders are heretics and mutants, their skin burned to charcoal by the God Emperor as a warning that his faithful had failed to heed. Under her command, the rest of the dead High Lord's followers sought to avenge their martyred master, and Terra was plunged into civil war as all hopes of a semi-peaceful transition of power and return to normalcy was silenced by power-armored figures clashing once more across the throne world. The brides of the Emperor were far from a match for the Pyre Guards one-on-one, but they far outnumbered the sons of Fukin, and there were millions of Frat Eris Templars on Terra responsible for enforcing Vandire's will. Blood flowed in torrents, and agitators and doomsday prophets raised entire mobs of terrified civilians, sending them to die at the Salamander's guns. To prevent things from escalating, the Custodes finally involved themselves in the conflict, with Shield Captain Amon Toramakian leading a host of 300 Custodes out of the Imperial Palace to join the Imperial Dragon. The sight of the Golden Warriors fighting alongside the Salamanders was enough to break the will of many of the rioters and turncoats, but not all. So trapped in a spiral of self-deceit was Alicia Dominica that not even the sight of the Emperor's own custodians fighting alongside the Lord of Drakes was enough to make her realize the depths of her folly. Instead, she convinced herself that all hope was lost, and that even the Emperor's closest companions had been turned against him by Fukin's lies. In her madness, she enacted Vandire's direst contingency plan, designed in the deepest throes of paranoid madness by the dead usurper. Alicia led a contingent of the surviving brides to the Astronomicon itself, bringing with her tech priests whose loyalty was enforced by the threat of bolters and heretical devices implanted inside their augmented brains. With them was a relic of the dark age of technology, a bulky and ugly thing that hummed ominously and had spent millennia locked away in the deepest vaults of the Mechanics. What its initial function had been, none living now remembered, but it had been rigged by Vandire's servants into an enormous bomb, meant to ensure that if Vandire couldn't rule over Terra, then nobody else would. Warned of the danger by the Custodes and his own librarians, Fukin rushed to the Astronomicon's defense, but it was too late. Seeing the Lord of Drakes approach as the gates of the Hollow Mountain were within sight, Alicia activated the device and the bomb detonated. As it was still outside the Astronomicon's projection chamber, the worst-case scenario was averted, but the dark tech device was still powerful enough to irreparably damage the complex and ill-understood machinery of the beacon, which spread far beyond the Hollow Mountain itself. The light of the Astronomicon died. All across the galaxy, the beacon on which navigators relied to guide ships through the madness of the Sea of Souls suddenly went dark. On Terra, the psychic backlash was immense, scouring an entire continental mass almost completely clean of sentient life, a mass graveyard of ruined buildings, amidst which the regenerating form of the Imperial Dragon soon emerged, howling in horrified grief at what he'd failed to prevent. The collapse had begun. He sits on his gilded throne, built of the still-twitching corpses of his foes. Around him, his servants scurry in the dark, bringing him pieces of meat to feast upon and cowering from his wrath. None can challenge his might, and yet he isn't content, his belly forever gnawed by hunger even as his feverish mind sees enemies in every corner. In his anger, he lashes out, condemning those who have the misfortune of crossing his gaze at the wrong moment to death. He tears them apart with his claws and devours their entrails, but this only brings him a short respite before he sees more threats. On and on this goes, the hunger and the fear growing worse and worse, until both reach a paroxysm where he's constantly eating and killing, until there is no one alive but him, bloated and bloody. Then, for the first time, there is light, as the fire of a great-scaled beast burns through his lair, cleansing it all in flame and burning him alive, his screeches and squeaks silenced at last. Then he wakes up, a king of rats on a verminous throne once more, and the whole cycle begins anew, a short and bloody reign, and then punishment in fire. This is the fate of Goj Vandire's thrice-damned soul, now and forever. Chapter 48, The Collapse. Malum Datum, 303.m36. It could be said that, in the warp, the dying of the Astronomicon was followed by a brief moment of stunned silence. Such a statement would be ludicrously wrong, of course. There is no silence in the Sea of Souls, ever, nor will there ever be until the last star of the Milky Way flickers out and dies, and entropy at last claims the galaxy until the next universal cycle. But in one particular interpretation of the realms of chaos, where the dark gods were more than figments of the imaginations of the galaxy's living and dead granted existence by the dimension's infinite energies and the desperate need of mortals to put names and faces upon the evil that dwelled within them, the members of the primordial pantheon looked at Holy Terra in shock. They hadn't thought things would go this far so quickly. Even ever-scheming Tsiench was surprised by how far Vandire's posthumous vengeance had gone. To the ruinous powers, The collapse was more than the extinction of the Astronomicon, catastrophic as that was in itself. With divine eyes, they saw the psychic cataclysm spread across the very soul of humanity. The faith in the imperial creed, which the primordial pantheon had once feared would herald the rise of the eternal tyrant, collapsed under the weight of Van Dyer's atrocities, crowning generation after generation of faith-backed oppression. The chances that the eternal tyrant would come into existence, which had been steadily decreasing since Horus had begun the Long War, now became almost inexistent. Furthermore, as the Astronomicon died out, terrible warp storms immediately surged into existence, completely blocking all travel and scrying in and out of the Sol system and its closest stars. Even the dark gods could not peer through that veil, though they could tell that their old enemy yet clung to his pitiful existence, refusing to give in to the inevitable. And so began the Age of the Collapse, an era which would rival the Age of Strife and Horror and Devastation. Sanguinius is weeping. His second sight is ablaze with visions of the horrors to come. So much death, so much pain. They have failed, and now the galaxy will burn. And yet, he can still glimpse it, of only barely. It is so very faint. So very unlikely. But it is there, in the roiling darkness that devours the future. A small glimmer of hope. And so the Lord of Angels gets back to his feet and spreads out his wings, before taking to the skies once more. For he still has a part to play. Just before the collapse, astropathic messages had been sent from Holy Terra telling of Fukin's execution of Van Dyer. As might be expected of such momentous news, the reactions were as varied as they were severe. On thousands of human worlds, the psychic backlash of the collapse was the push too far, the strike of the lash that made even a beaten-down dog turn against its master. The population rose up in rebellion against the ecclesiarchy and the governors who had ruled as tyrants on the justification of having been appointed by the God Emperor. Millions of priests and officials were dragged out into the streets and brutally executed by enraged mobs. The followers of the Medhai Lord and the most fanatical members of the ecclesiarchy named Fukin a heretic, whose murder of Saint Van Dyer had so angered the God Emperor he had abandoned the entire Imperium. Gathering followers too caught up in the frenzy of fanatical belief, as well as too committed to the atrocities of the Reign of Blood to turn back, the cardinals who had risen under Van Dyer's rule assembled vast armies of Frateris Templars as well as immense mobs of bloodthirsty zealots and began their purge of all those they saw as responsible for the Emperor's silence. Prominent among their targets were the Space Marines, whose original betrayal was the reason the Emperor had been trapped on the Golden Throne in the first place, and who had now revealed that their whole breed was steeped in treachery and blasphemy and couldn't be trusted. Entire sectors burned in civil wars and zealous pogroms. Segmentum Solar, that had been the bastion of Van Dyer's power, was the worst affected of all. There, the ecclesiarchy's hold had been at its strongest, supported by the Inquisition in order to protect the most sacred part of the Emperor's dominion. In his paranoia, Van Dyer had concocted doomsday plans to be enacted in case of treachery or rebellion against his bloody rule, and those were activated without pause by his followers. Entire star systems were burned to ashes by Ministorum Apocalypse fleets. Beyond Segmentum Solar, the Astra Militarum, that monolithic organization tasked with assembling the uncountable hosts of humanity under one banner, crumbled. The Guard's chain of command had always been loose, a necessity caused by the sheer size of the Empire and the delay in communication, but it had always been there all the same. For decades, billions of soldiers had fought in the Ascension Wars, only for the throne world and the light of the Emperor to be lost just as they celebrated their victory. Entire regiments gave in to despair or heresy, while others still clung to their faith and waged new wars against all those they perceived to be heretics. The most crazed followers of Van Dyer blamed the Space Marines as well. Hordes of fanatics hurled themselves at Nocturne in ramshackle fleets, only to be destroyed by the defenses of the 18th Legion's home world. Space Marines of all loyalist legions found themselves beset by their former allies, though many instead chose to rally to the Astartes banner, helping defend vital star systems and reforging their bonds of brotherhood in fire. Yet those were but small islands of order amidst a sea of fear, anarchy, and madness. So fell the Imperium of Man that had been built in the crucible of the Great Crusade and tempered in the fires of the Horus heresy. Meanwhile, in the Eye of Terror, the world of Malum shook with Horus laughter. The Prince of the Eye had 100 schemes and more to weaken the Imperium, and now, the entire rotting edifice had collapsed because of something neither he nor any of his rivals in the eye had done. Part of him was vexed that his planning was for naught, but the rest was eager to finally claim the crown that had been denied to him during the heresy. Horus knew that, though Terra was shrouded beyond the ability even of the dark gods to scry, his father yet endured. While the collapse had shaken the very foundations of the warp, the actual death of the Emperor would have had much greater repercussions, which wouldn't have gone unnoticed. But the so-called master of mankind had been removed from the great game, and the galaxy was free for the taking. The War Master of Chaos raised his banner and called for all his allies to gather. The time had come at long last to end the long war and begin their conquest of the galaxy. But first, they had to force open the Kadayan Gate, where ever-vigilant Dorn still kept watch, even as the Imperium burned around him. Yet it wasn't Horus who would strike the first blow of the traitor Primarchs in this new age. Following the shutdown of the Astronomicon, the Radiant War had come to a sudden end. The angelic hosts were left broken and adrift by the loss of the beacon, and were swiftly slaughtered by Angren's blood legions. Left without his endless supply of enemies to kill, the Prince of Blood bellowed in fury and turned his gaze elsewhere, seeking fresh foes to satisfy his unquenchable bloodlust. Within weeks, Horusian sorcerers reported that the Daemon Primarch had manifested outside the Eye of Terror, rampaging across Segmentum Obscurus at the head of a demonic horde of a scale rarely seen before outside the galaxy's great warp storms. Angren's rampage hadn't been planned by Horus, but the War Master of Chaos was eager to take advantage of it. With Segmentum Obscurus thrown in further disarray by the hordes of the Blood God, Horus led his hosts to the Kadayan Gate, opening a path through the Eye's tumultuous borders with the great power bestowed upon him by the Dark Gods. At his side were Conrad Curze and his Night Lords, and Perturabo and the terrible weapons the Lord of Iron had crafted in the Forge of Souls since its conquest and bequeathment to his legion's keeping. Cut off from the rest of the galaxy by warp storms and Angren's rampage, Kadaya yet stood defiant, kept from succumbing to anarchy by the peerless command of Rogel Dorn. But all of Dorn's fortifications and all of the Kadayan's courage wasn't enough to hold back the tide that emerged from the Eye of Terror. Perturabo's doomsday weapons shattered the Praetorians' defenses, and soon Rogel Dorn was brought in chains on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, that the man he'd once called brother might gloat before executing him. On the living, pulsating thing that had once been a hololithic display, the image of the Eternal Crusader its escorts could be seen emerging from the warp at Kadaya's edge, desperately pushing toward the battle. But it was too late, they could do nothing but join their comrades in death. Surely their commander knew this, and yet the fleet pressed on, driven by the unshakable loyalty of the ancient dreadnought Sigismund who led them. "Look, brother," Horus Lupercal mocked. "Your little knight is coming to rescue you. How unfortunate that he's too late." Dorn didn't give the War Master the satisfaction of an answer. He merely continued to stare at him, his eyes burning with hatred and contempt. "Is this really what you wanted?" Plus asked Ormuzd. Ozek's brother stood behind him, clad in the armor of a space marine. Since Horus had kept his word and resurrected him, plucking his soul from the realms of chaos and covering it in flesh born of Ozek's own, his reborn twin had ever been at his side. No longer had he been afflicted with the curse of the flesh change that had taken him from Ozek, just as Horus had promised, the price for the allegiance of the one who had been called exile back then, at the dawn of the Legion Wars. No. This wasn't what he'd wanted. Horus had kept his side of their bargain, he had returned Ormuzd, tearing his soul from the warp and restoring Ozek's brother completely. For this, and for the hope of one day undoing the sin of the rubric, Ozek had sworn his loyalty to the first Primarch, despite knowing it had been his hands that had sent the wolves to Prospero. Looking upon Dorn's defiant face as he stared hatefully at the Prince of the Eye, the arch-sorcerer felt as if a veil had been removed from his sight. In a terrible moment of clarity, he realized that this wasn't worth it. For thousands of years, he had done Horus' will, helping spread rebellion and anarchy across the Imperium, telling himself he was planting the seed of free thought and human ascension when all he was really doing was cause more bloodshed and suffering. He had fought his legion, the very brothers he hoped to save. He had become everything the Space Wolves had accused the Thousand Sons of being and worse. Enough. Blood of the gods, it was enough. For the first time since he'd been a child on Terra learning how dangerous his gifts could be, his heart weighed by guilt and crushed by remorse, Ozek Ahriman unleashed the fullness of his psychic power, without restraint or control. Before everything vanished, he heard Horus call out to him in shock, but he didn't listen to the first Primarch's words. He had listened to them for far too long. In the centuries to come, many would ponder the reasons for Ahriman's actions. Some would claim the collapse had, however briefly, freed him from the lies Tsianch had woven around his soul. Others would argue that in this as in all things, Ahriman had acted at the behest of the architect of fate, his own pride keeping him from seeing the strings guiding his every deed. Regardless of the cause, the unrestrained power and anguish of the arch-sorcerer of Tsianch was a terrible thing. Throughout the entire Kadayan system, the warp screamed, and the Chaos Fleet was scattered. Horus' plan of an unstoppable conquest was smothered in its crib. The fabric of reality around Kadaya was permanently scarred by Ahriman's cry, though of much of it was due to Perturabo's apocalypse engines already damaging the fragile boundary between Materium and Immaterium remained unclear. Navigation through the Kadayan Gate became even more unreliable than it had previously been. The Traitor Legion's navigators could still find a way through, used as they were to the vagaries of the Eye of Terror, but each journey would be more grueling than before, and maintaining fleet cohesion was all but impossible. Ozek Ahriman himself was absorbed into the warp, the Materium no longer able to bear the awesome weight of his presence. Transfigured into something just one step removed from full daemonhood, the arch-sorcerer took refuge in the formless wastes, and there built a fortress of regrets around him, where he dwelled with his brother, who had followed him out of fraternal loyalty. In times, others would join them, seeking refuge from the galaxy in order to reflect on their past sins and mistakes, much as Ozek himself did. The Kabbalites, who had once helped Ahriman cast the rubric and had later joined him under Horus' patronage, promptly fled after their leader's betrayal of the Prince of the Eye. They knew that they were tainted by association, and the magnitude of the arch-sorcerer's treachery was such that they could expect no quarter from their former allies. Kadaya was dying, and so was he. The planet had been broken apart by Perturabo's infernal machines, and the psychic calamity had only made things worse. Daemons rampaged freely on the cracked surface, hunting down the last remaining humans who clung to life. Not him, though. Even now, as he laid down broken and bleeding, having been transported from Horus' flagship by the uncontrolled energies of the Empyrean, its denizens yet feared him. The thought gave him no satisfaction. No thought had given him any satisfaction for a long, long time. The sound of footsteps made him move his head, the motion sending spikes of agony through his broken neck. He recognized the creature from the reports he'd received of the war Guilliman had fought against the Pale Wasting. Centuries had passed, but his eidetic memory recalled the information as if it'd been yesterday, a gift that had become a curse over the millennia of his long vigil. "Rejoice, Primarch Rogaldorn," it said in a synthetic voice. "Eternity awaits." In Aftermath, the City of Cities, long-brewing plots reached their final phase. The Masters had spent their entire exile from the Forge of Souls plotting their revenge, and now they unleashed their weapon upon the Horusian Enclave, the newly ascended Master War, who was whispered to have once been a mere mortal, remade by the Masters into their equal for the sole goal of ending the Prince of the Eye's usurpation. Through great intrigue and effort, the Masters had imbued a human being with power greater than that of most daemon princes, and shaped them into an exceptional combatant and strategist, something that they themselves had never been suited for. This Master War confronted the Horusian ambassador in single combat after leading the armies of Aftermath into battle. During the duel, the ambassador's identity was revealed as none other than Belaker, the Dark Master of Shadows and First of the Damned, who had joined Horus for his own unknowable reasons. Their confrontation left much of Aftermath in ruins, but in the end it was Master War who emerged victorious, banishing Belaker back into the warp and cementing the Master's undisputed control of the City of Cities and its vast resources and arcane treasures. This was only the beginning, however. On their way to their strange ascension, Master War had learned the truth of the consequence, a mysterious phenomenon known to lead to the horrible death of all who learned its secrets. The consequence was a daemon created by Horus Lupercal himself, tasked with hunting down and destroying all those who learned his direst secret, that the wound dealt to him by the Emperor aboard the vengeful spirit had never healed. Every time the Prince of the Eye exerted his full and terrible power, it would reopen anew, crippling him for centuries at a time. When the consequence had come for the future Master, they had managed to trap it and consume its power, marking them in the eyes of the masters as worthy of joining their ranks. With the power and leadership of Master War, the forces of Aftermath launched a series of raids on Horasian territories, cutting off the flow of supplies to the front. Master War also forged an alliance with the Orphans of Time Warband, which had fought against the War Master for a subjective eternity from within the time-lost borders of his realm, as well as Thoranos Elijah, the Saint of Chaos and Daemon Prince of the Primordial Truth. Together, these forces attacked Malum itself, and though they were ultimately repelled, the prison globe of Haklorven was broken during the fighting, unleashing the Daemon Lords and their toy kingdoms back into the great game. With Belaker's essence churning within the realms of chaos and beyond their reach for now, the Daemon Lords turned their ire upon Horus, who had kept their prison within his palace like a prized bauble, a humiliation none of them could ever forgive. Had the Daemon Lords been able to work together, they might very well have destroyed the sons of Horus' capital world, but such was their nature that, even after being gifted their freedom, they couldn't let go of the many hatreds they had cultivated for one another during their imprisonment. Taking advantage of the Daemon Lords' internal conflicts, the Horasian sorcerers were able to repel the firsts of the damned, casting the Daemon world of Haklorven out of Malum's skies, though the rogue infernal planetoid would become a recurrent threat to the Prince of the Eye's interests, as it moved seemingly at random throughout his dominion. With Rogaldorn having slipped from Horus' grasp and his traitorous subordinate having ruined their planned campaign, Perturabo, bitterly reminded of what had happened at the Siege of Terra, greatly decreased his support for the Prince of the Eye. The Doomsday weapons were left to the Horasian forces, but most of the 4th Legion either returned to the Iron Warriors' holdings in the Eye of Terror or went their own way, seeking conquest and plunder amidst the ravaged Imperium. Perturabo himself returned to the Forge of Souls, claiming that with the Masters active once more, he needed to be present to protect this great prize. With the cataclysm at Kadaya, the threats to his power base, and the ever-present threat of Sanguinius finding him and completing their long-delayed destined duel, Horus had no choice but to give command of his forces' advance into the Imperium to his son Abaddon, while he returned to the Eye of Terror to put things in order. The former first captain of the Sons of Horus, who had served as his Primarch's right-hand man throughout the Crusade, the Heresy, and the Long War, vowed to prove equal to the task. Despite the immense difficulties caused by Ahriman's cry, Abaddon prosecuted the conquest of Segmentum Obscurus with great skill, his name becoming a curse on the lips of the imperial citizens who were faced with his fleets and armies. In Segmentum Obscurus, the dread fleet of the 8th Legion had been separated from the main bulk of the Horasian forces by Ahriman's cry. Rather than try to rejoin his allies, however, the Night Haunter set his sons on a rampage of devastation and atrocity across the already much tormented Segmentum, seeking to break the will of its people so that they would meekly kneel before their new masters, although this was merely a pretext to indulge in the darkest desires of his deranged mind. The combined might of the Night Lords proved more than anything they encountered could hope to match, until, on the hive world of Khorani's Agathon, the garrison of 10 Billion's Imperial Guards managed to finally blunt their depredations. For thousands of years, the people of Khorani's Agathon had cultivated an ancient grudge against the traitor legions, resisting all efforts by the various cults to subvert them during the Long War. For months they held on, even as the Night Lords unleashed ever greater horrors upon them and the civilians they fought to protect, until salvation came on a pair of great white wings. Sanguinius, the great angel, had arrived. The sons of Kurz might have been willing to clash with mortals, but the prospect of facing a Primarch was another story. Wherever Sanguinius flew, the Night Lords fled, the closest thing to terror an Astaroth's can feel filling their black and craven hearts. Their morale bolstered by the great angel's presence, the Agathonians fought with renewed vigor, and it seemed they were about to triumph and force the 8th Legion off their world. Then Conrad Kurz himself descended upon Khorani's Agathon, his arrival heralded by a wave of nightmares and madness that swept the entire planet. The Primarch of the Night Lords had spent centuries mastering and perverting the gifts the Emperor had wrought within his flesh, and though he had yet to fully abandon the guise of mortality and embrace daemonhood as several of his traitor kindred had done, his powers were considerable. All but the bravest of soldiers broke and ran at his approach and that of his personal guard, and daemons born of the darkest fears of humanity coalesced into existence. Only Sanguinius could hope to face the Night Haunter, and the Primarch of the Blood Angels went to face the brother he had once fought on Makridge and later thought to have cast into the void trapped in stasis. You have changed. We all have. I see the truth now, of the monster I've always been. and it frightens me no more. Then you are truly damned. It ends here, Conrad. Does it? Perhaps. Surely you have realized by now that nothing is set in stone, brother. The future is what we choose to make of it. In the end, the only things that really matter are power and will. The battle between the Great Angel and the Night Haunter was like nothing the galaxy had seen since the days of the heresy, and even that paled in comparison. The two Primarchs had honed their gifts for millennia, their strength growing as one of them fought endlessly to preserve their father's kingdom while the other delved ever deeper into the arcane depths of his own madness. Over the course of several weeks, the duel of the two Primarchs laid waste to an entire hive, which mercifully had been mostly abandoned, though untold thousands were still caught in the crossfire. In the end, Sanguinius was victorious, the broken body of Conrad Kurz laying at his feet. Yet before the Great Angel could finish, his demented brother, Talos Valkyrin, the Soul Hunter, gave his life to buy time for his brothers to evacuate their injured father back to the fleet in orbit. With one of their greatest heroes slain and their father unable to lead them, it didn't take long before the 8th Legion splintered once more. A small contingent, including the Legion's flagship, returned to their home world of Kurlasium at once. There, apothecaries and sorcerers worked feverishly to heal their Primarch, using obscene amounts of Ockerly in their attempts to mend the flesh wrought by the Emperor and corrupted by ages of cruelty. A few wondered what such efforts might transform the Night Haunter into, but their doubts were swiftly silenced. Meanwhile, the rest of the 8th Legion scattered across the ravaged Imperium, adding their depredations to the horrors of the collapse. Following his bittersweet victory, Sanguinius departed Khorani's Agathon after promising its people that, though the hour was dark, hope yet remained if they could but fight on. The Great Angel traveled back to his home of Baal, and there called his legion to him. Backed by his psychic power, his summons were heard despite the storms racking the Empyrean, and thousands of blood angels made the journey to their legion's home world, soon forming the greatest concentration of loyalist space marines in the galaxy. They brought with them many other Imperial forces seeking guidance, and with this great army the Lord of Hosts set to work carving a refuge for beleaguered mankind. While this kingdom of angels would face many threats over the years, none of the great powers of the Eye were willing to risk confrontation with the Primarch of the Ninth. As the Imperium crumbled in on itself and the Emperor seemed to be completely removed from the affairs of the galaxy, the one genius with the audacity to think himself his equal made his move. For thousands of years, Fabius Bile had provided the traitor legions with new recruits, trading the expertise of his consortium for exorbitant prices at the array of space stations located around Newgate, the antediluvian portal located within the Eye of Terror and leading to the mysterious heart of his new empire. Now, just as the Long War suddenly spiked in violence and the traitor legions needed fresh recruits more than ever before, the Clone Lord gave the order to enact plans that had awaited activation before the first deal had ever been made at Newgate. Quietly, the consortium withdrew all but its most disposable assets through the gate, before detonating powerful, world-destroying charges hidden across the ancient megastructure. Within moments, Newgate was left a desolate ruin, and the one known access point to the new empire had been removed. With this weakness plugged once and for all, Fabius Bile raised his own banner. Seeing himself as the only one fit to give humanity the strength needed to survive the collapse, the Manflayer set the armies of gene-bred warriors he had cultivated within his new empire to the task of conquest. From the cluster of extragalactic suns that had served as his base of operation since he'd discovered it by accident, Bile led the swift subjugation of several imperial sectors. Many of these sectors' worlds had been quietly ruled by Bile's new men for generations without the Imperium noticing, and amidst the madness of the collapse they joined the new empire with little fanfare or resistance, most of their citizens never realizing the true nature of their overlords. On the surface, the worlds of the new empire fared better than most during the age of the collapse. They were defended by Bile's ships and armies, protected from raiders and demonic manifestations. The new men ruled with an iron fist, crushing all dissent, but such wasn't all that different from what the Imperium's reign had been in the last decades. Behind the curtains, however, the primogenitor continued his ruthless experiments, using the populations of entire hive cities to test the new genetic patterns he'd designed, or emptying them completely when he needed raw material to create a new army. From his stronghold in Deliverance, Corvus Corax waged campaign after campaign against the enemies of humanity. Following the second fall of Caliban, the Raven Lord had kept himself separate from the high politics of the Imperium, but had thrown much of his resources in the Transcendent Wars. Even deprived of the preternatural veil of secrecy that had shrouded them for thousands of years, the Raven Guards were still masters of stealth, and many Imperial victories had been won thanks to their unseen and unheard presence. Yet Corax knew that, for all his legion's prowess, it couldn't hope to fight the traitor legions that had been unleashed by the collapse head-on. With great effort, the Raven Lord once more deployed his unique gifts. This time, however, rather than conceal his legion in the shadows of history, he deployed a great veil upon the Kievar system, making it impossible to reach to all but those guided by one of his gene line. From this safe haven, the 19th Legion was free to continue the long war, though their Primarch was left unable to leave his lair in order to maintain the spell. Many millions of refugees were guided to Kievar's safety, dedicating their lives to the service of the Raven Guard as thanks for their salvation from the collapse's horrors. On Medusa, the Iron Hands, who had already spent the last decades under constant assault by the Transcendent Ones, continued to endure. Those mortals who sought their protection were screened for any sign of taint and ruthlessly purged for any deviation, with the rest immediately put to work in the mines and forges of the 10th Legion. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Ultramar initially weathered the collapse better than the rest of the Imperium, thanks to the structures built there by Robert Guilliman before his fall. Yet soon, the Ultramarines and their allies found themselves under constant attack by the Word-bearers and their slaves, eager to avenge the shame of their defeat during the Horus Heresy. The collapse had at last roused Lorgar from his contemplation of the primordial truth. After reasserting his control over the Dark Council, the Urizen had declared that the Legion would focus its efforts on bringing the 500 worlds low. Dark Apostles raised armies of demented cultists from worlds lost to madness, and demonic legions were summoned before being hurled at Ultramar. Few word-bearers were present in those attacks, serving as leaders and champions, but sheer numbers still slowly eroded the strength of the 13th Legion and its allies. Prior to the collapse, Ultramar had been home to few inquisitors for various reasons, not the least of which had been the relative low need for their presence, especially where the Ordo Hereticus was concerned. Now, however, the word-bearers took advantage of this lack by preying upon the spiritual vulnerability created by the collapse. The Ultramarines were forced to increase their policing of the worlds under their protection to prevent cults from sabotaging the war effort, slowly but surely walking the same path as the rest of the Imperium, much to Lorgar and the Dark God's amusement. Yet still, Ultramar endured, even as its flame flickered and grew weaker little by little. The lesser Chaos-aligned powers also took advantage of the collapse. The two surviving Inferna Astra, these malevolent warp stars given baleful sentience by 1,000 suns ritual gone awry, had long dreamt of extending their reach beyond the domain granted them by the treaty they'd struck with the Prince of the Eye. Long had their enslaved Myrmidons smuggled mirrors spelled with their fell radiance past the Horusian quarantine surrounding their dominion. Now, with the power of the Prince of the Eye shaken, they activated a scheme centuries in the making. Using a vast orbital installation dating back to the Dark Age of technology and meant to convert sunlight into vast quantities of power, they exposed the denizens of an entire world to their sinister light, enslaving billions in a single rotation of the world. Immediately, these new thralls began to work defacing the temples of the ecclesiarchy and building new monuments in their place honoring their new infernal masters. Once this defilement was complete, they began to work on altering the orbital installation so that it might travel from one world to another, bringing the eldritch gospel of the Inferna Astra wherever it went. From the Maelstrom, the piratical armada sworn to the Daemon Prince of Chaos Undivided Urieg, the Dark Admiral, launched a campaign of conquest that subjugated dozens of worlds. From the Bridge of the Unbridled Fury, the Dark Admiral oversaw the complete destruction of all who opposed him, directing the damned souls of his lost fleet and those who had pledged themselves to his service with all the skill he'd possessed as a mortal brave enough to defy Horus himself. Great strongholds and shipyards were built in these new territories, and new vessels were constructed there with materials plundered from even further afield. Soon, however, Urieg's ambitions found themselves stopped by the 5th Legion, the White Scars. For centuries, the sons of Jagatai Khan had kept watch over the Maelstrom and guarded Ultima Segmentum from the raids of the Lost Fleet, though their ability to prosecute war had been badly hurt by the collapse. The warriors of Kogarus retained their indomitable spirit and tremendous skill at void warfare. The 5th Legion and the Dark Admiral were soon locked into a complex conflict fought across a score of fronts and more. their ships dancing in the void as neither had the resources to wage war on the planets for which control they fought. On the edge of Segmentum Pacificus, the kingdoms of the dead suddenly launched massive attacks on neighboring systems, spearheaded by Death Guard plague marines in unprecedented numbers. A grand and nightmarish ritual had resulted in the opening of a permanent warp portal between the First World where the undead plague had manifested and the plague planet of the 14th Legion, in the Eye of Terror. On the Imperial side, led by Mort Arian himself, the forces of Nurgle made swift progress, conquering sector after sector. On the Pacificus side, after rapid initial gains, the Nurglite hordes led by Typhus soon found themselves faced by a coalition of Pacificus' various powers. From the Ur-Council of Nova Terra to the Hexarchy and the Prophet of Cogs, all had banded together in a fragile alliance against the hosts of Rot. These factions had their differences, indeed, the Prophet's contempt for the Hexarchy's use of warp-wrought engines of war was legendary, and the two had clashed multiple times over the years, but faced with the prospect of annihilation, or worse eternal deathless servitude, those had been put aside. The Imperial soldiers of the Hexarchy fought side by side with the elite Skitarii legionaries of the Prophet of Cogs and a dozen other armies against the Death Guard and their hordes of plague zombies and other horrors. Many on all sides decried the alliance as unnatural, but none could deny its effectiveness. A secret member of that grand alliance, and responsible for much of the endless diplomatic efforts and hidden background deals necessary to keep it going, was none else than Mariana herself. The ancient prophetess had departed Segmentum Obscurus in her efforts to spread the rites of transcendence after the fall of Kadaya, deciding that Pacificus was more suited to her goals. At her side was her new champion and general, recruited from an ancient, well-hidden mausoleum within the Eye of Terror, Iskandar Kaon, once a captain of the 15th Legion, once a member of Ahriman's cabal, who had turned against the arch-sorcerer as the rubric slipped from his grasp and had later fallen in battle against his exiled brother during the Legion Wars. Ahriman, it turned out, hadn't killed him, instead ensorcelling him so that he would fall into a deep slumber, and the events at Kadaya had weakened the spell enough for Mariana to break it, allowing the ancient sorcerer to awaken to a galaxy much changed. In a great battle of will and psychic might, Kaon forced Typhus to flee, halting the kingdoms of the dead's expansion into Pacificus. Still, by the point Mortarian's own advance finally stopped as the Lord of Death now sought to consolidate his holdings, no less than 77 sectors had fallen under his sway. Unspeakable horrors were visited upon the billions of humans who dwelled there, as Grandfather Nurgle showered them with his pestilent gifts, remaking an entire span of the galaxy into a gruesome mirror of his own loathsome garden. Their combined victory against the Death Guard served to cement the tenuous alliance between the powers of Pacificus, as none were willing to risk weakening themselves to the point Mort Arian or another Daemon Primarch could make a play for the kingdoms. Without an active war to keep them united, however, they might still have drifted apart and end up in conflict, but such a situation was prevented by the sudden arrival of Karn the Betrayer, the chosen of Khurn. The Blood God had grown dissatisfied with the fragile peace that had risen in Pacificus. The Lord of Skulls had found the endless struggles of the kingdom pleasant, and refused to tolerate their end. In order to stir things up, the Blood God displaced his favored servant from the Eye of Terror and straight onto the forested world of Tanith, where a cabal of powerful daemons masqueraded as guardian spirits, offering power to the planet's population in return for ever-growing sacrifices. After a series of brutal duels, Karn compelled the people of Tanith to follow him. The ranks of Karn's warband were soon swelled by the Vergastian immortals, made deathless by the use of dark technology that slowly drove them to madness, and the revenants of Gavian 11, whose monstrous bloodlust, born of the attempt to clone captured gene seed of the 9th Legion, made them perfect servants of Khurn. The lords of Vergast and Gavian 11 were overthrown in bloody uprisings led by the Betrayer, and together with Tanith as daemon-packed warriors they began a new blood crusade across Pacificus. World after world burned under the threat of the Betrayer, and soon the kingdoms of Pacificus sent their own armies in response. The peace of Pacificus had been shattered, and no matter the victor, this was enough for Khurn. For all that the other traitor legions had adapted the design, the Thousand Sons remained the original authors of the portal spells that had allowed their cousins to prosecute the Long War efficiently. And in the millennia since they'd shared them as part of the pact that had ended the Legion Wars, the Sons of Magnus had continued to improve upon them in myriad ways. With the collapse crippling the Imperium and Horus' own conquest slowed to a crawl, the Crimson King made his own move. Following psychic visions sent by Magnus the Red, the Psyker communes the 15th Legion had sponsored throughout the Imperium made their way to the ashen wasteland of Prospero, and there enacted a great ritual that was mirrored on Sorcerias. Hundreds of thousands of unbound Psykers, who had mastered their gifts by following the teachings of the Thousand Sons, rent open reality and brought the planet of sorcerers out of the Eye of Terror. From there, the Thousand Sons launched their own campaign of conquest, and there was little the worlds of Ultima Segmentum could do against such combined psychic might. For untold generations, the psychically gifted had been persecuted and demonized by the rest of humanity. Even those who had survived and managed to reach the shelter of the Thousand Sons communes had lived in fear of discovery and execution, or of being fed into the Astronomicon. Now they finally struck back at their oppressors, and the result were awe-inspiring. Enemy armies were obliterated by raw warp energy or mind-controlled and turned against their masters, while entire fortresses were razed with a gesture of the more powerful Psykers. At the command of the exalted sorcerers who led them, they conquered precisely 999 worlds, though dozens more were left burned to the ground or transformed into daemon worlds by rampaging imperial energies. Within this new Prosperan dominion, the Thousand Sons and their grateful followers built terrible wonders of arcane engineering and sorcery. Continent-spanning temple laboratories dedicated to Tzeentch were erected, within which the uttermost limits of sanity and reality were tested and pushed ever further in pursuit of an enlightenment that would never come, but whose pursuit fueled the architect of fate's power and gave his pawns new ways to do his bidding. In the anarchy of the collapse, Zeno's threats thought long suppressed returned to lay waste to humanity once more. Orc numbers surged as they waged wars against human territories no longer capable of calling upon the overwhelming might of the Imperium for aid. Meanwhile, Dark Eldar raiders under the banner of Asdrubal Vecht preyed upon what little human shipping still coursed the stars as well as on isolated worlds. Their estranged cousins, the Craft World Eldars, were caught in the grip of bloody-handed Cain. Since the ruin of Commeric, the followers of the Dark Prince had seemingly dedicated themselves to their extinction, and the age of the collapse let them operate more freely than ever before. Slaaneshi warbands roamed the stars, following the guidance of powerful daemons as they sought any trace of the children of Isha. Craft World after Craft World fell to their depredations, though Ulthwi had managed to remain hidden, using powerful and costly rituals to conceal its location from the hungry gaze of she who thirsts. The Sha'ilat, reborn Yildari apostles of Slaanesh, took particular delight in hunting down the descendants of their prudish brethren. Their greatest weapon in this pursuit was the creature that had once been Lelith Hesprax, but which had been transformed by the Dark Prince into a hunting hound of peerless lethality, whose leash rested in the hand of Ziriat, the Song of the Deep, who had departed aftermath in the wake of the Master's declaration of war to join, or, as some whispered, rejoin, the children of Hell in the domain granted unto them by Horus. As for what few of the ancient Necrons who were awakened in the age of the collapse, they wisely remained away from it all. They kept watch over their tomb worlds and waited for the foolish mortals to finish destroying one another so that their eternal empire could, when the time was right, rise again to reclaim the stars. Perhaps they were the wisest of all, or perhaps they were blind to the true threat of chaos' ultimate victory. Slowly, painfully, the galaxy was dragged deeper and deeper into the ravenous maw of the primordial annihilator, the best efforts of its brave defenders seeming to do nothing but prolong its agony. Yet as Sanguinius had foreseen, there yet remained a glimmer of hope. Chapter 49, Epilogue. Terran Standard Calendar, 404.m37. The old soldier walked amidst the desolation of Terra. The world was a corpse, but humanity endured amidst the bones, like vermin dwelling within the cadaver of some great, long-dead Leviathan. The trillions of souls who had called the throne world home had died to fire and strife, blade and bullet, but most of all, they had died of famine and sickness as the last supplies ran out and no new shipments came in from off-world. It was a pattern the old soldier had seen repeat many times across his long life, though never on such a scale. He could imagine the desperation settling in, driving people to ever darker deeds in the name of survival. The wolf and the hunter walked at his side, allied in purpose and faith despite their opposing titles. The first one, he had found in the deepest parts of the Sea of Souls, where only his lineage protected him from annihilation as he searched for one of the oldest concepts in a place even the archenemy's influence couldn't reach. The other, he had met by chance, or something that looked like chance at the time, during one of his rest stops in the labyrinthine dimension. They were much changed from what they had once been. The wolf had lost the mantle of flesh that cloaked his soul fire. It was only through a constant effort of will that he maintained his current guise, rather than stride this broken land in his true and terrible lupin form. The hunter's skin was covered in scars, wounds that would never properly heal, inflicted upon him by beings who made agony into an art form. The old soldier mourned many of those who had been lost in the centuries since he'd failed to reach his old friend in time. But he did not mourn the fate of Komarok and its inhabitants. There was little justice in the universe, but that had been justice. Despite his injuries, the hunter still carried himself with effortless grace. He carried a blade at his side, made from a broken shard of the labyrinth, its tip sharpened down to a single point in real space. There was nothing that blade couldn't cut, nothing it couldn't kill, and in the hunter's hand it had slain more than its fair share of abominations seeking to prevent their odyssey from reaching its end. Without it, and without the hunter, the old soldier would never have made it all the way here. One day, the hunter had told him, he hoped to kill those his people called the Yaksha kings with that blade. The engineer walked behind them, and in his way he wasn't any more human than the wolf and the hunter. There was a lot more metal than flesh within his body, and unless the old soldier missed his guess, some of that metal operated in principles that would have seen the engineer turned to his composite particles by the Martian priests before the collapse. Of course, things had changed since then. Mars had fared better than Terra, but only just. Its remaining overlords were in no position to challenge the engineer when he had arrived with the rest of the group, walking through a hidden portal on Luna and accompanied by 1,000 of his new, enhanced space marines. Primaris, he called them, and claimed to have improved upon the design. The old soldier could see the improvements, but he hoped the engineer had also figured out how to keep them from burning the galaxy a second time. Humanity needed more soldiers, that much was obvious, but whether it needed more transhumans was another question entirely. Even as they walked across the throne world's corpse, the engineer's servants were at work in the void, inspecting the thousands of drifting hulks that had been trapped in Sol by the collapse, identifying which ones could be salvaged, rekindling old plasma reactors and awakening slumbering machine spirits. There was enough inert metal in the system to build a sizable fleet. And behind the four of them, there were others. None of them had ever been on Terra before, but even they paid their respect to the desolation and kept silent. Ildli, the old soldier, wondered how long it had been since someone had laughed on that benighted rock, laughed, or smiled, or sung. At the ruins of what had been the inner palace's gates, the Imperial Dragon greeted them. Once, the old soldier had distrusted dragons. He had a long history with the beasts, and his encounters with them had never ended well. But the Imperial Dragon was different. In the wake of the collapse, he had sought to bring order to the devastation unleashed by the fanaticism of those who believed, with the same self-righteousness that had doomed so many since the dawn of human sentience, that they alone knew the truth and that it gave them the right to punish those who did not. What little life still existed on Terra was because of him, working tirelessly to rebuild a semblance of sustainability, harvesting the biological detritus of the uncounted dead to fuel primitive generators and grow crops from a handful of carefully husbanded seeds. Only a few hundreds of thousands endured, where once there were trillions, but as the old soldier had heard it said once, he who saves a life saves the world entire. They entered the ruin of the Imperial Palace, long brought low by time and lack of proper maintenance, though still awe-inspiring even this desolate state. There the custodes waited for them. There were very few of them left, each over 1,000 years old. The means to create more of their number had been lost, perhaps forever. But the remnant of their brotherhood still kept to their ceaseless vigil. These ones let them pass at a nod from the Imperial Dragon. The old soldier had hoped they would, had hoped that on this journey, at least the last stretch would be easier than the last time he'd walked on that husk of a world, back when it had stood on the very brink of being devoured by chaos, in the last, timeless, and awful day of the heresy. He had wondered, during what few quiet moments there had been in his odyssey, if Horus really knew what had happened then. How the War Master's victory had been made impossible by 1,001 small, insignificant acts in the shadows of the eschatological civil war he and his father stood at the center of, the twin eyes of a cataclysm that had broken the galaxy in two. How his masters, not his allies, never his allies, no matter what lies he had been told and had told himself, had set him up to fail, and in failure bring the old soldier's once friend low. But the plan had changed. The old soldier remembered it well, even if he hadn't understood it at the moment. The course of history had pivoted on its axis with the choice of the four. Horus had been spared annihilation in order to become the instrument of humanity's corruption, rather than a sacrificed king in waiting. Did he know? More accurately, was he even allowed to know, to realize? The false four had their hooks deep within him. They had hollowed him out long before the traitor armies had reached Terra, taken the Emperor's work and remade it in their terrible image, a vessel to fill to bursting with their power so that he may end the threat of the anathema. It had taken a miracle for Horus to survive long enough to even confront his father, and another one to restore him to the broken half-life that ruled over the Eye of Terror and led the forces of chaos in the Long War. The old soldier didn't know the answer. Maybe he would, one day. Most likely not. That was probably for the best, given what knowledge of chaos tended to do to someone. They walked in silence, until they approached the location of the inner sanctum. The group split up then, one half continuing up toward the holiest of holies, the other descending into the depths below. Those who descended weren't, and had never been human. In their jubilant triumph, the dark gods had turned their eyes away from shrouded Terra. The pressure on the Webway Gate, the core of the great Project Magnus the Red ruined forever in his arrogance and foolishness, slowly abated as demonic legions were called to other, more important battlefields of the great game. Now it was low enough that this gamble could be made. The songsmiths of Ulthwee sang the words passed down from their Ildari forebears through 12 generations of their long-lived species, gathering their will and power, melding their minds together into a construct greater than the sum of its parts. When the end came, it did so suddenly and without warning, like an amputator's blade descending while its wielder is still counting down, a white lie to avoid the patient tensing her muscle and making the cut harder and more painful than it needs to be. Even so, the backlash would have been devastating, if the entire world wasn't already a psychic wasteland. But it was done. The Terran Webway Gate was no more. The powers had been denied their one road through the storm's shrouding Sol and its neighboring stars. It was, in the great scheme of things, a tiny victory, for all the effort that had gone into forging the alliance that had made it possible, and one that might yet mean nothing. But it was a victory nonetheless. At long last, they approached the pain engine the rest of the Imperium had called the Golden Throne. Impossibly, it still functioned, kept going by increasingly desperate repairs performed by tech priests entirely too aware of the doom its failure would unleash upon them all. A corpse sat on it, broken and ruined by the hands of he who was called, even now, 1,000 years after the collapse, the Prince of the Eye, kept at the very boundary of life and death by the stasis generators humming all around it. Despite everything, the old soldier felt a pang of sorrow at the sight of the man he had once followed reduced to this. Even with the Webway Gate shut down, and the pressure of keeping it closed removed, the agony of the wounds inflicted by Horus remained. It had been a long time since the old soldier had been put under the effects of stasis himself, but he remembered all too well how any pain, no matter how minor, remained exactly as sharp throughout the entire period, and the injuries of the Emperor were anything but minor. "Let's get to it," he said, turning to the wolf, who nodded in response, before letting go of his human guise. The old soldier didn't shiver at the sight of the great canine that his mind interpreted the wolf's true aspect as, but it was a close thing. He was impossibly tall, with fur the gray of burning cities and eyes the color of tarnished gold. His teeth and claws were the blades that killed traitors, gleaming with the light of judgment. The old soldier heard the Imperial Dragon gasp at the sight of what his brother had become, and heard the custodes' hands tighten around their weapons. But none of them moved. They all knew what was going on here, the true and terrible import of what was to come. The wolf opened his maw and spat out the sun he had swallowed, deep in the Imperial Sea, and kept within his belly ever since, even as its fire burned him from within. The stolen sun shifted between infinite forms, before settling down onto the one most heavily represented in the history of that dead rock they all stood on, a golden apple. The fruit of life. The old soldier picked it up, and raised it toward the enthroned cadaver with one hand. In the other, he held the athame with which he'd cut his way through time and space since the death of Kelth. The blade was old, a tool of murder from before man had completed his evolution to his current form. Life in one hand, death in the other. The symbolism was important. He had to do everything right, or else this would all have been for nothing. Two opposed impossible things had to be done at the same time, a paradox made possible only by the unique nature of all the elements involved and the location where it might or might not happen. With the blade that was not a blade, kill the god who denied his own divinity. With the fruit that was not a fruit, resurrect the man who could never die. With a prayer on his lips to a power only he still believed in, the old soldier acted. The next few moments were impossible to remember. All the power of the God Emperor, the eternal tyrant that could have been, accumulated through millennia of worship and sacrifice, was brutally dispelled by the death of its mortal vessel. It was cast adrift into the warp like shrapnel, razor-sharp pieces of it embedding themselves into like-minded souls and transforming them into saints of an aborted godling. That was the knife's work. The fruits was equally impossible, equally grandiose. When the old soldier's senses returned, the throne and cadaver were gone, and a man stood in their place. The old soldier didn't know what the others saw when they looked at him, but he saw him as he always had. One of the first men, not all that tall, with eyes that had seen far, far too much. His aspect as the emperor was gone, for now, perhaps forever, because the old soldier doubted it would be used again. "All your news," he said. "You came back." "I did," the old soldier shrugged. "Somebody had to help clean up this mess." The old soldier did not kneel. He had knelt before the man once, but would do so no more. "Well," said the once and future master of mankind as he looked away from his gathered sons and allies and up at the stars. "Let's try to do better this time. I will be relying on you all." And so ended the age of the collapse, and began the age of hope. Dawn. The sunlight is weak, barely visible through the clouds of smoke and poison that fill the atmosphere. There is blood everywhere, and the air echoes with the moans of the dying. This world is just one of many where the blood angels fight to protect the remnants of humanity who sought shelter in the shadow of their Primarch's wings. Just one more battlefield, the faces of the enemy change, but the goal remains the same. This time, the foe wore the colors of the World Eaters and their hordes of once proud freedom fighters turned slaves to the Lord of Skulls. They are all dead now, but it doesn't matter. More will come. Every soldier on the planet, from the captains of the 9th Legion to the lowest militia trooper, know this as fact. Always, always more will come. This war cannot be won, only fought, because the alternative is intolerable. For all but a handful of the dreadnoughts and veteran Asteroutes who fought in the battle, this is the only life they have ever known. 1,000 years is a long time to humans, even if it is but a blink in the eye of the universe. This endless struggle is their past, their present, and their future. But something has changed. The people around him, human and transhuman, do not realize it yet, and he will not curse them with hope that might never become real within their lifetimes. But he can feel it, with senses that have grown sharper every century since his doom was delayed into an unwritten future. The dark gods are no longer laughing. The future is grim still. There are many wars to come, and victory is far from certain. But for the first time since Horus rose anew on Davin, the dark gods are no longer laughing. And so, for the first time in over 7,000 years, Sanguinius smiles in genuine joy and hope. Author's notes. And here we are, at the end. I hadn't planned on writing this so quickly, but I was reading The End and the Death, the latest volume of the Siege of Terra series, and I couldn't help myself. Also, since I started writing this before the Siege series started, there are a lot of elements of this FIC's early chapters that would need rewriting to fit, but no matter. This is fanfiction after all. To clarify what exactly happened in this chapter, 1,000 years after the collapse, Al-Yaniu's person came to Terra accompanied by Leman Russ, Jagatai Khan, Belisarius Kal, and a bunch of Eldar Bonezingers. They shut down the Webway Gate on Terra, and then, using the fruit of life Russ had been searching for in the Empyrean, resurrected the Emperor. Now they have 2 Primarchs, Kal, the Primaris Marines, and whatever remains within the Sol system and the neighboring systems. And the dark gods are no longer laughing. Neither, I can assure you, is Horus. Oh, and Sanguinius foresaw this happening. Why do you think he didn't break Vandire's miserable neck decades before the collapse? In the last chapter, I mentioned Sigismund showing up to help at Kadaya, while he was supposed to have died a long time ago, at the Battle of Cronus. That was a mistake on my part, but I didn't correct it. Turns out, Sigismund wasn't going to let a little thing like being dead, and that was after being made into a dreadnought, mind you, keep him from trying to save his Gene father. As one of my readers on SB put it, Sigismund is the hype. Am I going to write a sequel to this? Probably not. Now the only alternate 40k timeline I have to keep in my mind is the Robotian heresy, and it's already complicated enough. Feel free to come up with your own stories taking place in the age following the Emperor's rebirth. I think I left plenty of openings for lots of stories to be told in this new age of hope. There are plenty of characters and factions, plots and prophecies. Or maybe you would rather tell the story of one of the new saints born of the shards of the God Emperor's scattered power. In any case, it's been a journey, much longer than I planned for when I started writing this. I hope you enjoyed reading it as much as I did writing it. Zahariel out. Check the description for the links to the author.